the book is going to be like Unseen Realm. It's an academic book. Hopefully it's readable. But this is the title. Okay, Reversing Hermon. It's about specifically not the whole book of Enoch in the New Testament, but very specifically the chapter 6 through 16 in Enoch, which is the story of the Watcher's transgression. How that story sort of leaks into the New Testament in various places. And it's more than Peter. It's more than Jude, okay? But how that story leaks into the New Testament and sort of matters for New Testament theology. So that's the whole guts of the book right there. Now, why did I think this would be a good idea? The few notes up here. I mean, I'll just give it to you in a nutshell. It's kind of amazing. This is also like Unseen Realm in this respect. I've said in many interviews that the dirty little secret of Unseen Realm is that nothing in the book is unique to Mike. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's true. Nothing in the book just sort of popped out of my head. And, oh, this would be a good idea. I'll throw it in a book and people will like it. Okay, nothing like that. Everything in the book you can find in peer-reviewed scholarship. That's just what I do. I don't really know how to do anything else, so that's what you're going to get. It's kind of amazing. Every chapter in this book, and the stuff we'll go through here, is either represented by journal articles, somebody's dissertation, a book, something like that. So it's the same goal, to try to take, again, high-end scholarship on, in this case, the story of Enoch, the transgressions, and then how that leaks into the New Testament. Try to take that stuff and then make it decipherable and digestible for somebody who's not a specialist. Okay? It's astonishing nobody's ever done that. Again, everything that's in the book is going to be traceable somewhere, but there isn't a single book, either in the academic world or in the popular world, where somebody's actually collected that stuff and put it between two covers and called it a book, which is just sort of astonishing to me. Now, this last year, the first something sort of like that appeared. I can't remember who. I think it was either Oxford or Brill. Somebody did something on the Gospels, Enoch and the Gospels, but that is the first of its kind. So this book is going to be kind of unique, and hopefully you'll enjoy it as much as Unseen Realm. I'm taking for granted that most of you, if not all of you, have read Unseen Realm or sort of have heard an interview about Unseen Realm, because that was Greg's thing, on the website. Make sure people know this. But as far as, again, that basic introduction, the Watcher story, Watchers is a biblical term. Again, it's only in Daniel. It does occur more frequently outside the Bible. But here's what sort of drove the bus for me as far as picking this topic. It wasn't just that, hey, I could throw all this together and there's so much of it I can make a book out of it. It was kind of this question that popped into my head at some point in an interview. Because in Unseen Realm, you get the answer to this question, but it's not your typical answer that most Christians would give. If we ask the question, why is the world and all humanity so thoroughly wicked, what's the average Christian going to say? The fall. Okay, because that's what we're taught. And it's not that the answer isn't the fall. The answer is the fall plus two other things. Okay, so if you ask this question to an Israelite or a Second Temple period Jew, again, Second Temple period is academies for intertestamental period, roughly 500 BC, all the way to the destruction of the Second Temples. Second Temple's built, 516 or so, all the way to 70 AD. That period, if you ask somebody living in that period who, again, was biblically literate, they had read their Bible and lots of other stuff in the serious Jewish tradition. And I would suggest, and what this book, again, attempts to show, even the earliest Christians, the very beginnings of what we call sort of the early church or the early church fathers, they would not have said only the fall. They would have said, well, there was this thing, the fall, but they also would have said there was this thing that happened in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and also the whole Tower of Babel thing, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview that I talk a lot about. But for this occasion, and of course this book, we're going to focus on the middle one. And this is a quote from, I don't know if it's from me or from somebody else. That's from me. I can't even tell what it is. If it's not for me, there'll be a source there. So I'm the source. Okay, a number of New Testament passages say what they say because they're literary expressions of a significant theme in New Testament theology. Again, if you're just walking in here and you've never read Unseen Realm, if I'd said that the Watcher story is a theme in New Testament theology, you'd think, who is this crazy person? Okay, like we've never heard this, and you haven't, and it's a shame that you haven't. But there's a big theme in New Testament theology, the reversal of the wickedness that has permeated the human race. And again, a big part of that is reflected in the book's title. Reversing Hermon alludes to the notion, hidden in plain sight in a surprising number of New Testament passages, that what happened in Genesis 6:1-4 had to be reversed in part of restoring the original Edenic vision. That reversal was, is, and will be accomplished by the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. So what I'm saying there is when especially a Second Temple Jew who was either looking for Messiah or in the decades that followed the events of Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection, they would have been thinking about their Messiah not just in terms of a guy who's from the line of David who's going to come here and he's going to deliver us, and they were always thinking military, okay? Who's going to deliver us from oppression, from the Romans. He's going to restore the kingdom of Solomon and David. That's not just what they're thinking. One of the things that they associated with the Messiah was he's not just going to come back and deliver his people from oppression. He's going to come back and undo the effects of all this garbage that has happened, in antediluvian history. Fall, Genesis 6:1-4, and the Deuteronomy 32, the Tower of Babel worldview. Now the last one is real familiar to, again, if you've read Unseen Realm, because reclaiming the nations is how you fix the Babel problem. Because you bring the nations, the Gentiles, back into the family of God. The Messiah is for them as well as the Jew. So that's pretty familiar. Of course, the fall is familiar. This middle part is quite unfamiliar. Now, to orient you, this is a basic outline of what we call the Book of Enoch, popularly in academic talk and in the way the book gets cited. What you think of as the Book of Enoch is actually First Enoch. There are 3 books of Enoch. The first one is the one that, again, gets dated to prior to the New Testament era, okay, on into the cusp of the 1st century. The other 2 are later. Okay, so what we're talking about with the Book of Enoch, that again you hear about a lot, is First Enoch, and it's in the first part, Book of the Watchers, that our focus is going to be. First Enoch 6-16 tells the story of the Watchers, whose primary sin is marriage with humans and procreation of giants. The Watchers beget giants on earth by their union with human women. Out of these giants come evil spirits. Again, the origin of demons. We're never told specifically in the New Testament where demons come from. We are told that in First Enoch, and First Enoch gets it because it understands the original context of Genesis 6, the whole Mesopotamian backdrop of that, which we'll talk about today in more detail. So out of these giants come evil spirits that lead humanity astray. In the short term, the crisis of the Watchers is resolved when God sends the flood to cleanse the earth. Enoch is introduced in chapter 12 as a scribe, whom the Watchers ask to intercede for them. He ascends to heaven on a cloud, comes before the heavenly throne in chapter 14 in a passage that is important for the history of Jewish mysticism. His intercession is rejected. Again, the Watchers are like repentant after God punishes them, and they basically get a hold of Enoch. I don't know if they picked up the phone or whatever. We're never told. Hey, can you go talk to God for us because God really likes you? You're the one who is taken out from the earth and you walked with God. And can you let him know that we're sorry and, will he forgive us? And God basically says, no, you're toast. Essentially is, you're in there until the time of the end. Which I think, again, we'll touch on this today, is Revelation 9, when the Watchers are released. But the Jewish traditions are pretty consistent here. So Enoch, again, is asked to intercede. It's rejected. The Watchers abandon heaven for the attraction of the flesh. Enoch represents the opposite tendency. He's a human being who is taken up to heaven to live with the angels. So Enoch becomes this prototypical, good guy, figure. Again, and even in that statement, this is from John J. Collins, his article on Enoch. You can see a theme of reversal there too. But it becomes really prominent when they start talking about Messiah. Now, why haven't you heard this before? Well, there are a number of obstacles to it. I would say, again, just the way we're taught, there are points of incoherence in the way we're taught. You're taught to avoid books that are not in your Bible, okay, Old and New Testament. And on one level, I think we can all understand that. One of the jobs of the church is again, to prevent false teaching from coming in and so on and so forth. And, there are things in extra biblical books that, are deeply flawed and, just kind of crazy talk too. But it misses the point that biblical writers read lots of stuff that isn't in the Bible. They were like you. Surprise, surprise. They were people. And they read stuff. And what they read stayed in their head. And some of that stuff helped them articulate points that they made while they were writing. It's just a very human, normal kind of thing. So for you to be taught to avoid reading that stuff immediately divorces you from the context of the writers. And so my simple suggestion is, if you read that stuff, who cares if you think it's canonical or not? I don't think Enoch is canonical, but I don't really care. Because if you read it, it'll help you in some points follow what somebody in the New Testament is saying, if you just know what's sort of lurking in the background. Now, the early church, you had a few people defend canonical status. In this book, I give you in an appendix all of the places where some early church father quoted Enoch as scripture. They do that. A couple of them do that. So when you read things, I don't know if I have the quote here. Yeah, I do. Now, in a paraphrase here, the bottom one. This is kind of representative. I'm not going to tell you what source it comes from because I don't want to ruin your enjoyment of the book because it's actually a good book. The pseudepigrapha books are those that are distinctly spurious and unauthentic in their overall content, and no such formula as "it is written" or "the scriptures say" is connected with these citations. That's just wrong. Okay, it's just wrong. There are Jews at Qumran who were not liberal. Okay, I hope you realize this. The Jewish sect at Qumran formed their little cloister because they thought the Pharisees were compromisers. Okay, these were not liberals, okay? I mean, they're like nth degree just off the map in their conservatism. But yet they will quote Enoch on a couple of occasions in citation form, like as the scripture says, and then they'll quote 3 or 4 things, and among them is 1 Enoch. Okay, they'll do stuff like that. So for a few, at least one Jewish sect, this book was considered sacred. There are a few church fathers that also considered it sacred. Tertullian, going back here, Irenaeus, Origen, kind of went back and forth. Clement, back and forth. But Tertullian is sort of its biggest defender, and Irenaeus endorses it in 1 or 2 places, but Irenaeus pulls some of his theology from Enoch even without citing it. Now we know that because we have the book and we can go look it up, what he's quoting from. So these are some major figures. I doubt if we have a patristic scholar in here, but you've probably all heard these names. Okay, these are not insignificant people in the history of the early church. And they thought it should be in there, at least a couple of them, but eventually, they lost that debate. So the book itself, my book, is divided into these sections. So the first section, we go back into Genesis 6:4. There's 3 chapters in this section. The first one is going to look familiar because it's sort of a rewrite of some of the stuff in Unseen Realm, even though that covers like 3 chapters. I've sort of bunched it into one and rewritten some things. And then the second 2, the second chapter is going to be about the book of Enoch itself. And then the third one is an entire chapter on the Mesopotamian context, which you do not get in Unseen Realm. You don't get the second chapter either. And then once sort of that's established, we go into the Gospels, the Epistles, and Revelation. Here are the appendixes. Again, I think the appendixes are pretty, I think they're worth the book itself, to be honest with you. Because these are the questions everybody asks. You know, who thought it was inspired? When do we date it? You know, where does it come from? The manuscript evidence. I give you a bibliography. Like, it's a real bibliography. It's an academic bibliography. I'm not citing, you know, I want to say some guy that was on Coast to Coast, but I was on Coast to Coast, so I can't really say that. But you get the idea, okay? I'm not just citing Billy Bob, you know, who was abducted by aliens. And I know about the Book of Enoch now. It's not that. And you're laughing because you know that there are people out there like that. And then where does the New Testament allude to, not just Enoch, but pseudepigrapha in general? There's a guy, a New Testament, you know, geek, New Testament scholar who has collected all these, and I got permission from him to reproduce. He posted it online to reproduce that in an appendix. It's great because it does all the work for you. And then there's a little appendix on the Antichrist. We'll get to that. So let's jump into part 1. Sin of the Watchers in its original context. Again, this is first Enoch material. I'm not going to quote Genesis 6 because you all know that. But I'm guessing a lot of you have never read the Enoch story. So let's just go through some of the basic parts of it. When the sons of men had multiplied, and in those days beautiful and comely daughters were born to them, and the watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them, they said to one another, come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. And Shemhaza, their chief, said to them, I fear that you will not want to do this deed, and I alone shall be guilty of a great sin. So apparently it was his idea, and he's like, I don't want to only be blamed when this thing just goes to hell in a handbasket. And they all answered him and said, let us swear an oath. Let us all bind one another with a curse, that none of us turn back from this counsel until we fulfill it and do this deed. Then they all swore together and bound one another with a curse. Now, you notice the deed, again, is cast in sexual tones. You know, let's go have children. But the real crime, I don't think we should miss. Again, if Unseen Realm, there's actually two views of sort of the supernatural perspective of Genesis 6. I don't want to leave this section without saying this. The real crime is that they want to raise up their own nations. They want their own populations. They want to imitate God without his permission. It's kind of a Gnostic flavor to that, if you know a little bit about Gnosticism. So this is what's going to become the real issue here. They were all of them 200, and they descended in the days of Yared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. Okay, Hermon is the key location. And they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound one another with a curse on it. Okay, this Hermon in Hebrew is related to, it's a better way to say that, same root as Harem. Again, the devote to destruction, to put under the ban, that sort of thing. So there's an association there between the terms. These and all the others with them took for themselves wives, and among them such as they chose, they began to go into them and defile themselves through them. Again, they defiled themselves. This is a transgression of heaven and earth. To teach them sorcery and charms, and to reveal to them the cutting of roots and plants, and they conceived from them and bore to them great giants. Asael, another character, taught men to make swords of iron and weapons and shields and breastplates and every instrument of war. He showed them metals of the earth, how they should work gold to fashion it suitably, and concerning silver to fashion it for bracelets and ornaments for women. He showed them concerning antimony and eye paint and all manner of precious stones and dyes. Now you're probably thinking of the passage in 1 Peter already about the cosmetic, issue. And there was much godlessness upon the earth, and they made their ways desolate. Shemhaza taught spells and the cutting of roots. And then you get a list of which watcher taught what to people. You get this whole list. You get signs of shooting stars, signs of the earth, signs of the sun, signs of the moon. Again, astrological stuff. They all began to reveal mysteries to their wives and to their children. As men were perishing, the cry went up to heaven. So in Enoch, even in this section and elsewhere in the book, the problem with all this isn't that we know how to make something that's made of iron, or we use, eye paint to make ourselves beautiful. The problem is what people did with it. It corrupted them. So it takes the problem of lust and makes it worse. It takes the problem of just any technology and makes it worse. People began to use things for self-destruction, for destruction of their fellow man, that sort of thing. So this is what the passage is going through. In a nutshell, what First Enoch is saying here is, look, we know we had this thing, the fall, and we know people are sinners. But they consistently blame the watchers for teaching people how to be even better sinners. Okay, in other words, giving them more tools to destroy themselves. And this isn't much of a conceptual leap anyway for us, because any technology that we have can be used for the same thing. Okay, I can commit horrendous crimes with a phone. I can blow things up with a phone. I mean, you can just use something that ordinarily it's just simple. It's technology. I mean, I can commit a crime with a fork. I can stab someone. Anything that we have, can be used to an evil end, and that's really what Enoch is going to be angling for here. And they blame part of it on people, the fall, because of just who we are. Our internal sinful impulse, the lack of, we don't have God's nature, God's character. We make choices to do evil. So people are going to get plenty of blame. But then people being taught, again, how to express their own impulses, their own wickedness in various ways. That's a big deal in Second Temple Judaism. First Enoch 9, you have 4 angels, archangels, Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel. See the terrible events unfolding on earth. They approach God for a solution. Basically, you got to do something about this. Look at what's going on. You have to do something about this. The 4 archangels say to God in 1 Enoch 9:11, you know all things before they happen. You see these things and you permit them. And you do not tell us what we ought to do with them with regard to these things. I mean, we're here to help. What should we do? God responds in 1 Enoch 10 with the news that should sound familiar to biblical readers. This is when you get the flood. When the Most High said, the great Holy One spoke, he sent Sariel to the son of Lamech, which was Noah, saying, go to Noah and say to him in my name, hide yourself, reveal to him that the end is coming, the whole world will perish, tell him that a deluge is about to come, so on and so forth. So in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Genesis 6, 1 through 4 precedes the flood. Okay? It's just that in Genesis 6, 1 to 4, those 4 verses to us, key thought here, to us lack context. We read them and it's like, well, what does that have to do with the flood? Why are these 4 verses even here? I mean, you get to verse 5 and okay, everything that man does is wicked. We get that. And then Noah starts to have this conversation with God, and then we have the flood narrative. Well, what do the 4 verses have to do with this? We lack the context. An Israelite, again, a literate Israelite, would not have lacked the context. That's the disconnect. A literate Israelite would know, oh, these 4 verses sort of compress this story that, is really a response to Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia has the same story. And the writer just sort of took it for granted, that people are going to know what I'm talking about. I don't need to just rehash all this stuff. And this is a precursor to the flood. People living in the Second Temple period had the context as well. We just don't, because we don't read that stuff. We don't read the literature of the great wider world to know these 4 verses in Genesis 6 are responding to something. This stuff in 1 Enoch is recovering or preserving or transmitting the larger story that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 was a response to. Okay, we lack all of that. And unfortunately, again, because of the history of the Christian church, we not only lack it, it's been kept from you. You have been cut off from it. Again, it's not like, oh, the gospel's really in Enoch, we're missing. No, that isn't the point at all. The point is that if you had read this, there are, again, things you would read in your Bible that would, okay, the lights go on. I kind of get what they're talking about here, because I've read this other thing that they were familiar with. So we have an immediate disconnect. Even with the flood story, we just get these 4 verses. So again, just to summarize here, we have the flood story, the judgment here in the second half. Until the day of their judgment consummation, again, the watchers are imprisoned until the eternal judgment is consummated. They're sent to the abyss, to the prison. Again, that's language you get in the New Testament, where they will be confined forever. And at the time of judgment, it's not really forever, it's until the time of the judgment. Well, when's the time of the judgment in biblical theology? It's at the end of days. What's the end of days? It's the day of the Lord, it's the return of the Messiah, all this kind of stuff. Okay? So there is a finite end point to this. But that's where they are. So this is a summary from, I believe, Reed's book. Yep. The birth of the giants is explored in terms of the mingling of spirits and flesh. Angels properly dwell in heaven, humans properly dwell on earth. But the nature of the giants is mixed. This transgression of categories brings terrible results. After their physical death, the giants' demonic spirits come forth from their bodies to plague humankind. The citations there are from 1 Enoch. According to 1 Enoch 16, the angelic transmission of heavenly knowledge to earthly humans can also be understood as a contamination of distinct categories within God's orderly creation. As inhabitants of heaven, the watchers were privy to all the secrets of heaven. Their revelation of this knowledge to the inhabitants of the earth was categorically improper as well as morally destructive. If you're interested, again, look at the title of her book, Fallen Angels in the History of Judaism and Christianity. Reed's book is a book about how early Judaism and early Christianity looked at Enoch, the whole book, and specifically this story. So it's a little older now, but it's still a great book. Context. Okay, now that you sort of have the Enoch story in your head, where does it come from? Again, it comes from the same, not source. It is a response to, and I think a fuller preservation of, the episode that we find in Mesopotamian literature associated with the flood. The biblical stuff, Genesis 6:1 through 4, this whole weird episode, is a response to something that the Mesopotamians wrote about and believed and thought it was great, thought it was good. The Israelites thought it was wicked and evil. So there's an opposition there. And so Genesis 6:1 through 4 is in the Bible to tell the Israelites that these events that preceded the flood were not good. They were evil. And it's going to ripple out into biblical history in all sorts of ways to sort of make that case. The story centers on the Apkallu. The Apkallu are the culture heroes from before the flood. The phrase culture heroes refers to the great civilizers. So, Thomas Edison would be a culture hero for us because, he harnessed the power of electricity to give us lights, okay? People, figures who do something really important to civilize life. Okay, that's what a culture hero is. In Mesopotamian thinking, the Apkallu are the great culture heroes from before the flood, in the service of Ea. Ea was the god of wisdom. A variety of wisdom traditions from the antediluvian, the pre-flood period, were supposedly passed on by the Apkallu. There were 7 of them in one particular story. The 7 sages were created in the river. The Akkadian for that term is in the abyss. So right away, you're getting a little creepy thought here. Okay, they're from like the underworld place, but the Mesopotamians thought they were great guys. Okay, they're wonderful. The 7 sages were created in the river, the abyss, and served as, quote, those who ensured the correct functioning of the plans of heaven and earth. They were really smart. Following the example of Ea, they taught mankind wisdom, social forms, and craftsmanship. That's from DDD. The Apkallu then were the wise divine beings from the abyss, from the underworld, the place opposite the heavens. They were responsible for maintaining the correct balance between heaven and earth. That was the will of the greater gods. And they possessed knowledge from the divine world that sort of made heaven and earth tick. Again, they knew lots of stuff. Well, the scribes of Babylon living after the flood took great pains to establish the notion that their own knowledge, what we scribes know, And therefore, the greatness of Babylon. This is why we're so smart, and this is why Babylon's so great. Why? Because our knowledge has been inherited from the Apkallu. Like they were our teachers and our mentors. Our knowledge, the reason Babylon is so great, again, in the eyes of the Mesopotamian, is that what we know, what we have built, the civilization that we have created and fashioned, and that is at the top of the heap. There is no greater place than Babylon. All of that comes from the gods. It's divine knowledge. And we as scribes are sort of the gatekeepers to that knowledge. Again, there's a little bit of a propaganda feel to this, obviously. But this is the explanation for why people should listen to them and why Babylon is so great and so awesome. Now the question, though, that surfaces is, well, these guys were from before the flood, so how did you guys inherit this knowledge? Because the Mesopotamians had the same flood story. Again, the great flood. So here's how they argue it. Mesopotamian text, again, this is very distilled. I got a whole chapter of citations on this. Mesopotamian material lists 7 pre-flood kings. There's a particular text that actually gives you a king list, kind of like the stuff you see in the Bible where so-and-so king reigned X number of years and all that kind of stuff. Well, there's a particular text that lists the king, and then next to the king's name is the name of the Apkallu who helped him be king, helped him, have the civilization flourish, okay? Gave him the knowledge he needed to run, Babylon, okay? So there's 7 of these guys before the flood. They are assisted by a specific Apkallu. Then after the flood, the text has 4 Apkallu, and they are described this way. They are of human descent. The pre-flood Apkallu are consistently described as being gods, divine beings. But after the flood, no, they're of human descent, and they are only 2/3 Apkallu. The 4th one is actually given a number. He's mixed, he's a hybrid, whatever term you want to use there. It's the same description, although in the text it's not the same person. It's the same description given to Gilgamesh, who is also referred to as Lord of the Apkallu in something called a cylinder seal. Gilgamesh was an Apkallu. Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine. Gilgamesh was also a giant in the Mesopotamian text. Again, Gilgamesh is probably the most familiar figure from the ancient Near East and just in popular circles. Well, he turns out to be a key figure here because he is a post-flood Apkallu who is a mix, divine and human, and also happens to be a giant along with these other guys. So you see, in this book, the last note there, you may not have known this, but Gilgamesh is actually mentioned by name in something called the Book of the Giants from Qumran. The Book of the Giants is not part of First Enoch, but it is described by scholars as Enochian material because a lot of the content of the Book of Giants you can also find in the Book of First Enoch. And there are a couple other giants named there as well in connection with the flood, before and after, so on and so forth. But Gilgamesh is actually in there. So just that one line, I just want to pause here a second, just that one text tells you that the Jews of this period were reading Mesopotamian stuff. Because you don't just start writing a book and, I need a name for this giant. What should I call him? Gilgamesh. Well, that sounds good. Where'd that pop into my... No, that isn't how it happens. They're reading Mesopotamian material. They had inherited Mesopotamian stuff. It's part of their framework. It's part of their, scholars would call, cognitive frame of reference. They were just familiar with the material. And they could tell, they knew, because they were familiar with the material, they could look back at Genesis 6:1-4 and say, oh yeah, we know what's going on there. We know what that's about. And again, they write about what that's about in books like the Book of the Giants, books like First Enoch. Again, this is all a matrix of ideas. And the reason, again, it's unfamiliar to us is because, now I hate to put it this way because it sounds pejorative, but I'm going to say it this way. It's because we're not allowed to read that other stuff. If you did, the lights would just go on in different places as you expose yourself to material. Again, the implication of all that, I mean, just look at the list here. The implication is that the post-flood Apkallu were the result of intercourse with human women. Now, in her essay on the Apkallu, this scholar named Ann Kilmer, she wrote an article. It's actually a chapter of a book. It's kind of hard to find. I don't think it's available online for free. If you were blessed enough to get in on the Divine Council bibliography project, this article is in that collection. But she actually picked up on this years ago, but didn't say a whole lot about it. She writes, humans and Apkallu could presumably mate, since we have a description of the 4 post-flood Apkallu as of human descent, the 4th being only 2/3 Apkallu as opposed to the pre-flood pure Apkallu and subsequent human sages. After these the mixed Apkallu die off, there's another term that's used in Mesopotamian text. It's the umanu, and that was the term for scribe. So you can see what the texts are suggesting. Divine knowledge comes from these pre-flood guys. It survived the flood in these hybrid guys, and we inherited it. That's why you should listen to us. That's why we're so smart. That's why Babylon's so great. Again, this is what they're doing. This is how they're framing it. Now, the apparent mating with humans displeased Marduk. Marduk is the high god of Babylon. He's the top of the heap. In the Era epic, he judges the Apkallu. This is Marduk speaking here in the text. I sent craftsmen, that's how the Apkallu are called, craftsmen, the guys who know lots of stuff, okay? I sent craftsmen down to the Apsu, again, back to the abyss. I ordered them not to come up. I changed the location of the Mesu tree and the El Meshu stone and did not show it to anybody. Now that reference is lost on us, but again, this is a quotation from, again, another particular scholar. Relocation of a tree, this is from Anus, I believe, and stones is also a motif in the Era epic, where Marduk during the flood changed the location of this tree and the stone in the context of sending the sages down to the abyss, to the Apsu. The garden with trees and precious stones, again, what does that make you think of? Ezekiel 28. I mean, it's the Edenic description. It's the same thing. Trees and stones. Again, it's not a coincidence. And if you read Ezekiel 28, it's very Canaanite in flavor, and the Canaanite divine council stuff, again, plays off of part of the same framework as the wider ancient Near East. Again, these are not coincidences. This is just literary artistry from people familiar with lots of material, and they're writing a book and they're throwing it in. This is how books are made. It's not a terrible surprise here. It's very comparable to the garden. And then in the end of the hero's journey in the Gilgamesh epic, again, Gilgamesh is seeking what? Eternal immortality, eternal life. He goes to where the gods are in this garden. Does this sound familiar? Okay, and it should. It's impossible to miss in these words Ezekiel's language of Eden. There in chapter 28, combines garden imagery, mountain imagery, lustrous precious stones, so on and so forth. The imagery from Marduk's comments about what he had done to the Apkallu, in effect, points to the banishment of the Apkallu from his own presence. Marduk's ticked. He said, "You guys did this. We up here, okay, in the heavenly places, we sent the flood because we wanted, the slate wiped clean. And what you guys did was you went down there and preserved." Not only, some of the people, again, the wider flood story, but also the thing that sort of just made the situation bad to begin with, or at least unfavorable, maybe to them, or to us, but not to them, is they loved, having all this divine knowledge. This is, they thought this is what made them great. And now here you go again. You've interfered, and this is all going to, again, start up again. We don't want humans knowing what we know. We want them lesser. We want them, if you're familiar with Mesopotamian stories, why were humans created? To be slaves of the gods. Okay? So Marduk is ticked. So he sends them back to the abyss. You're gonna just be here now. You're gonna be cut off from my presence. And this is where you're gonna stay. Again, does it sound familiar? This is what happens in the Enochian story we just read. It's the same set of details. They get punished, they get sent to the abyss. They're imprisoned there. Here's the summary. Again, I'm not going to read you all the points, but every point of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and every point of Enoch's version of it aligns with Mesopotamian material. Every point. What do I learn from that? What does that tell us? Again, it tells us that the people who are writing this stuff, Jewish people, Jewish scribes, again, these are not like theological illiterates, okay? And they're not just, crazy liberal Jews, okay? These are the guys who are in charge of transmitting the Hebrew Bible, transmitting the traditions, of their own people. They understand and they know the larger picture against which Genesis 6, 1 through 4 responds. They understand it, they've read it, they get it. And in their own literature, they not only play off Genesis 6, 1 through 4, but they play off the bigger backdrop, and they preserve it for us. And the point of my book is to say, well, that isn't all that happens, because since from the Second Temple period, we get guys like Matthew. We get guys like Mark. We get guys like John. We get guys like Peter. Okay, this is their world. The early church, the 12 apostles, again, shocker of shockers, were Jews, and they had read stuff. Like, what a profound thought. They weren't illiterates, okay? They were Jews who had been exposed to this material. And again, they're providentially chosen, they're providentially prepared to produce the books that we now call the New Testament. And in the course of writing those things, they're going to use stuff that's floating around in their head to express themselves, to express certain ideas. And God's good with that because he picked them. Okay, he picked them, put them in the right time and place, and said, I'm going to prompt you now to write something down that I want preserved for posterity. But we wouldn't know that unless we went looking, okay, unless we thought about what they're doing. Now, I've made the comment before that I think our doctrine of inspiration, I think, is undermined and made vulnerable when we divorce the human element from it. Okay, the books of your Bible do not just come by mental download. The prophet's not getting up, making breakfast, gets zapped, he loses control of his mind, his automatic writing, like in the X-Files, okay? He wakes up and says, wow, I can't wait to read what I just wrote. Okay, that is not how the New Testament itself describes inspiration. But we think like the people who produced the books of the New Testament weren't thinking about anything. Like they just got zapped and downloaded. Okay, when you strip the human element out of it, when you make it this paranormal object, it's very understandable if you believe that inspiration operates this way, that you don't want people reading anything else. You don't want them exposed to what actually the writers had exposed themselves to. And so this problem, this disconnect of how to understand what's in our own Bible is a lot bigger than we sort of imagine it. You know, you're talking about centuries, millennia of a crude history of looking at the Bible in a certain way. And again, it's not sinister. It's not like some cabal somewhere. We've got to cut people off from anything that's not. That's not it. It's just sort of a reflexive way it's taught. It's nothing, deeply sinister, but the effect of it is we have people who are underexposed to the context of the Bible, and then they have trouble understanding significant portions of it. That's the problem. And that's, again, what I'm trying to put a little dent in. Now, the other three parts, let me do a time check here. Yes, those of you have noticed that I actually have an iPhone this time. And I'm using it. Okay, a little time check there. Now, what I do from this point on in the book is, again, I go through all of that in 3 chapters because I want the story in your head. and I want the context in your head. And now we're going to traipse through the New Testament and see, where does this stuff show up? If we were thinking about all this stuff, what would we see in a given passage that would sort of jump out at us? And again, put us on different lines of thinking. And I would suggest lines of thinking that were in the writer's heads. Now, for the gospel section, I do something with the birth, the genealogy, and the ministry of Jesus. The last one, about 2/3 of that chapter is from Unseen Realm. I throw in the story of Legion, which is new. But the first two, again, you would have had to have read really the Portent, the second novel, to get any of that, or maybe come across something on YouTube. But as far as the birth of Jesus would have alerted literate first century Jews that the Messiah's arrival would reverse the sin of the watchers. And you say, that's just crazy talk. How in the world would hearing about the birth of the Messiah have made anybody think about Genesis 6, okay, the watchers thing? How does that work? It works because of Romans 10, specifically Romans 10:18 and following, Revelation 12, which is the astral signage of the birth of the Messiah, and again, various Second Temple traditions about the birth of the Messiah. Now, to summarize all that real quickly, again, you may have seen, how many of you have seen the YouTube thing of me going through Revelation 12 about the astral prophecy? Oh, very few of you, wow. Okay, during Q&A, if you want to drill down there, we could, but I'll give it to you in summary form. In Romans 10, it's the famous passage where Paul is talking about, hey, how are people going to hear about the Messiah unless somebody tells them? Duh. Okay, and so we have this problem. How beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel, and no one's going to hear without a preacher, and the preacher has to be sent, and that whole famous passage. Then Paul asks a rhetorical question. Have they not heard? And you expect him to say, well, of course they haven't heard, Paul. That's why you're so exercised. That's why you're so bent out of shape here. And you're telling us we need to go and be witnesses. But he doesn't say that. Paul says, indeed they have. And you're like, what? Well, what was the other 17 verses about? How does this fit? And he quotes as his proof text that they have all heard. He quotes Psalm 19 in Genesis 10:18. Psalm 19 is the passage. The heavens declare the glory of God. Okay. There are four verbs of messaging in the first couple verses. Heavens declare, they pronounce, they utter, they have a voice, okay, all this stuff, and it's just sun, moon, stars, and all this kind of thing. And the line that Paul quotes is, their voice has gone out through all the earth. The voice of what? Well, the voice of the heavens. And that's the Septuagint. The Masoretic text actually reads, their line has gone out through all the heavens. And I actually like the Masoretic text there because it's a reference to the ecliptic, the line in the sky. The ecliptic is where the zodiac constellations follow on an annual basis. So I can't prove it, but what I think Paul was referring to is Revelation 12. When John says, talking about the birth of the Messiah, it's Revelation 12, he says, I looked up at the heavens and saw. I think John actually meant what he said. Okay, we've got the woman with the 12 stars around her head, the sun in her midst, the moon at her feet. You can actually plot this out on an astronomy program. And when you do, there are other things that aren't mentioned in Revelation 12 that are really significant, again, to a literate person in the first century. You've got a conjunction of Regulus and Jupiter, the king star with the king planet, in the constellation of Leo. Okay, the lion, the tribe of Judah, okay? For a Gentile who doesn't know anything about the Hebrew Bible, that conjunction is important because both of them were signs of a royal divine birth. And here they're conjoined, and for a Jew, it's in the constellation of Leo. You have a 90-minute window when all these things are, it's actually 80 minutes. Somebody corrected me the other day. Got an astronomer geek out there, okay. All right, I'll try to remember that. I'll have to just throw away all my books now. But you have a really small amount of time, okay, where all this can occur. And if you plug it into an astronomy program, you get the birth of the Messiah on September 11th, 3 BC. 3 BC is not a problem. Everybody says, oh, it can't be 3 BC because then Herod would have to die in 1 BC. And we all know Herod died in 4 BC. Yeah, except for studies that have shown that 1 BC works quite well, which I've recently posted on my website. I did a happy birthday to Jesus thing on September 11th. You know, but what makes it important is that date in the Jewish calendar is Tishri 1. Tishri 1 was the date in the Old Testament when you inaugurate the reign of your next king. Tishri 1 was also thought to be the birth date of Noah. So Jesus, the Messiah, is the new Noah. Okay, you're starting to see how Genesis 6 sort of creeps into the picture here. What was significant about Noah? Noah's survival, Noah's presence on the earth post-flood signaled, it was supposed to signal the end of the Watchers, the end of all this wickedness, the end of all this garbage, okay? There are passages that refer in, again, Dead Sea Scroll text, to the chronology of the flood, okay, to some of this astronomical stuff going on. Specifically, they link it to the constellation of Orion, which in Aramaic is the constellation of Nephilah. Okay, it's the giant because Orion was a giant. I mean, you have this concatenation of thoughts that, again, to a literate Jew, if they had read John. Or, John, Revelation is the last book of the New Testament. So John got this information from somewhere, maybe Mary, maybe the disciple, who knows, he's one of the 12. But he writes it down. And if you had been exposed to that, you're thinking, wow, look, if this is what was in the sky, it means this and this and this and this and this. And to a Gentile, all those things are consistent because we've got the conjunction, we've got Jupiter, we've got Regulus, we've got Orion, we've got all this stuff. So when Paul says, yeah, they did know. Okay, I don't believe personally that what Paul is referring to is like, y'all know who D. James Kennedy is, familiar name? D. James Kennedy believed that you could get the whole plan of salvation out of the constellations of the zodiac. I think that goes too far. I don't believe that. But what I do believe that you could know is that a divine king had been born. I think that is what Paul's tracking on. Again, I can't prove that specifically. There's no verse, there's no footnote in Romans 10:18 that says, go look at Revelation 12. Because Revelation 12 wasn't written yet, so we can't quote it. But I think that's what he's tracking on. But if the point is for the book here, if you had that stuff in your head, somebody born on that day who turns out to be this Jesus of Nazareth, who's walking around doing all sorts of miracles and saying, like, I'm the guy, okay, that would have meant something to you. Okay, that would have meant this is the guy who is going to somehow reverse the effects of the wickedness of the world. Okay? It's not a terribly deep thought, but to sort of track with it the way they would have tracked it, is a different story. The genealogy, in a nutshell. Why are the 4 women in the genealogy there? They may or may not all be Gentiles, probably at least one of them, 1 or 2. Some people argue all 4 of them are. It's really not important if they're Gentiles, but why are they the ones included? Quote here from, her name is Amy Richter. This is from her dissertation. She says, while the inclusion of women in biblical genealogies isn't unusual in itself, there are 14 such women in other genealogies, namely 1 Chronicles 2. The inclusion of these 4 women is all the more odd. Who are they? Rahab. Anybody name them? You got Rahab, Ruth. See the neglected, Bathsheba, and Judah and Tamar. Okay, so the quote here is like, you'd think if you were going to put in 4 important women, you'd pick Sarah, Rebecca, okay, Rachel. I mean, major figures in the Torah, but they're not in. They don't get in. The 4 that do are sort of just kind of a mystery. Again, short version of this is that what Richter does in her dissertation, it's pretty recent. She did it at Marquette, which is a school that's becoming known for Second Temple studies. Her argument is that the reason these 4 women are in the genealogy is that there is something in their story, either something they did or something done to them that has something to do with sexual transgression, and the vocabulary used to describe the person and these events borrows vocabulary from Genesis 6. And so Richter argues that can't be a coincidence. And her argument is these 4 women are in here because they're 4 women who have scandalous histories or had something terrible happen to them in the line of the Messiah. And so the telegraphing, her belief is that, and I think she makes a really good case for it, the important point isn't these women and what happened to them and the vocabulary itself, it's who they produce, who they help to produce. Well, who's on the final end of the genealogy? It's Jesus of Nazareth. And so the one whose genealogy it is going to reverse the effects, again, of the 4 people in the genealogy that had these transgressive histories that point back in some way to Genesis 6. So she believes that Matthew essentially encrypted. I mean, for people who knew their stories, it wouldn't really be encryption, but for us it sort of is. People would have read the genealogy and asked, well, why are these women and not all the famous ones? And then as they thought about their histories, it's like, oh, okay, well, boy, her story goes back there, her story goes, they all go back there. That must mean something. Matthew's trying to tell us something. And what he's trying to tell us is that these 4 women who you would associate as Jews with this event, they're going to produce the one who undoes this. They're going to play a role here. So again, the whole chapter on that. The ministry, again, two of the 3 things here are familiar to Unseen Realm readers. In regard to Legion, if you have your, well, you don't need to look it up. I've given you enough here. The exorcism of Legion is about more than suicidal swine. It's about theological messaging, which practically everything in the Gospels is. Legion recognizes that Jesus is rightful Lord of the country of the Gerasenes, which is part of Old Bashan. But in Jesus' day, it was under Gentile dominion. Now, if you look up Mark 1:24, Jesus is exorcising demons in Jewish territory. And if you compare that with Mark 5, where they're in the land of the Gerasenes, it's Gentile territory. The way that Legion addresses Jesus is significant. Because when he's in Gentile territory exorcising demons, anybody want to guess how Jesus is addressed? He is the Son of the Most High. Most High is the key term. Where do we see Most High language that matters for this whole supernatural theology? It's the Deuteronomy 32 thing. Okay, when the Most High divided up the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. Most High is a term you would use if you recognize this is the Most High God. And the territory that we control here, that the people around us think is Gentile turf, really isn't. Okay? It belongs to him. So he can go over to the Jews and exorcise demons there, but to make the point that, oh, I'm not just the Messiah for the Jew. I'm not just here to reclaim this little thing about the size of New Jersey, okay? I'm not just here to take that back. I'm also Lord of all the territory. Okay, I'm the Son of the Most High. I am the rightful heir to your turf too. And so again, it's theological signaling. So again, just hinging on, and again, this isn't new to me. Scholars have noticed this for a long time. Why is Legion, why this verbiage, all this kind of stuff. So I included that in the chapter. When we get to the epistles, how many of you follow the podcast? Don't laugh. You know what's coming. Got a handful of you. The depravity chapter and the head covering chapter are 2 things that I did podcast episodes on. In this chapter, again, I get to actually give you the textual citations in the chapter. And then the baptism one is really a slight rewrite of something in Unseen Realm. But the depravity, the key verse is Genesis 3:19. when Paul is talking about the law, okay, the law was added. It's the same passage where he talks about the law, essentially, being handed down by angels and whatnot. So I do a little bit of that in Unseen Realm, but I don't do anything with the important phrase here. It says, the law was added because of transgressions. Okay, because of transgressions. Notice it's plural. Okay, it doesn't say the law was added because of a transgression. Because what scholars typically do is they'll read Galatians 3:19 and they'll think, oh, well, the law was added because of what happened in Eden. Okay, it's a reference to the fall. And this chapter is based, again, he's also from Marquette. In his doctoral work, a guy named, his last name's Stewart. Can't remember his first name now. It'll come to me. But he did a paper at SBL, which is the Society of Biblical Literature, a few years ago. And the paper was entitled something like the Law and Transgressions and the Bastard Spirits and the Birth of the Son of God. And so I looked at that in the program and I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to be at that one. Because I couldn't figure out for the life of me, what is this guy going to do? And it was awesome. Tyler Stewart, it was just awesome. And I afterwards I got his paper, but he argues, and I can give you the paper. I actually posted this on my website. And again, he said I could do that. He argues that when Paul says the law was added because of transgressions, he's not thinking about Eden. Just whose transgressions are we talking about? He's thinking of the Watchers and their corruptive influence on humanity. And so he goes through a whole panoply of Second Temple stuff and some grammatical stuff. And again, he says, if you read it this way, it answers certain questions that come in the chapter later on that scholars have kind of struggled with. What was Paul thinking? Because if you're tracking on Eden, then some of the proposed answers or some of the things Paul says don't seem to quite fit. And Stewart's like, yeah, there's a reason they don't fit, because he's not thinking that. If he's thinking this, then what he says over here and half a dozen other places makes sense. And so since Galatians 4, again, talks about the birth of the Son of God and in its relationship to the law and how we're heirs and sons and all this kind of stuff, he links the two things again. He's saying again, the birth of the Messiah is the real thing that would reverse the transgressions, not the law. The law was powerless to reverse these transgressions. The law was sort of like, to kind of either forestall or put a fence around or hold in the wickedness to a certain extent, but it couldn't really do anything more than that. And in fact, it became a thing that people would resist, again, because they're sinners. So it's a really interesting proposition. But I give you a whole chapter, again, of his argument with the passages and whatnot, and then talk about how it might fit in the bigger picture. I think he presents a really good case. The head covering, just go listen to episode 95. The head covering, the issue there is the phrase, because of the angels. And people have wondered about, well, why is Paul talking about, this head covering thing, and women, first part of the chapter, they should have their head covered. Then he changes and says, well, they do have a head covering. It's their hair, and I'm telling you this because of the angels. It's like, what in the world is this guy on? What is he talking about? This chapter, again, in that episode of the podcast, this is going to sound, I always have to say it this way, this is going to sound like the craziest thing you've ever heard. So I'm just prepping you. I'm just prepping you if you've never heard this. Just go back and listen to episode 95 or get the book when it comes out. There's a guy named Troy Martin. He teaches at Xavier now, or he did when he wrote these articles. But I came across it was a series of 3 articles printed over the course of 11 years. It tells you how fast things get published in journals. But the first one was Martin's article where he argued that the head covering, the woman's hair is her parabolaion, the head covering, is actually in Greek medical texts the word for testicle. And you think, what in the world does that have to do with anything? his whole article is going through Greek and Roman, Greco-Roman medical texts and showing, and he quotes Hippocrates a lot, he quotes Aristotle. They believed that a woman's hair assisted in fecundity. That is, when a woman had sex with a man, her hair, they believed, actually helped draw the semen up into her uterus through the course of her body so that she would get pregnant. That's why you don't cut it. Okay, you shouldn't do that. And that's also why it's a shame for a man to have long hair, according to Hippocrates, because the male role is to eject semen, not retain it. It's totally bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. But when you read what they thought of the function of a woman's hair versus men, everything Paul says in that passage makes sense. Yeah. It just makes sense. But it's so foreign to us that we know where babies come from. We talk about genetics and do this in a petri dish, and they're not doing that at all. Okay, they're not doing that at all. This is Hippocrates, who at the time was like the leading figure. There's one great thing about the test of infertility. That's just great. How it involves having a woman smell something and the hair is involved. It's just the craziest stuff you've ever read. But if that's what you're thinking, if that's what's in your head, when you read Paul, you're like, oh, well, of course. Of course, when we're in church, we should wear a covering over our hair, because then it's an issue of modesty. Would you go to church and just expose your genitals? Would you do that? Would you do that? I mean, that's essentially what Paul's saying. You people are nuts. Of course, he's writing to the Corinthians, and they probably could, they're doing everything. So, he's like, you people are nuts. Of course, you should have, your head covered when you go to pray and you do these things. And of course, it's a shame for a man to have long hair, again, because he's presupposing this function. A woman's hair is given to her as her covering, as her parabolaion. This is her glory, because it helps her to have children. And children are really important, okay? And then Paul throws in this thing about, now I'm also writing this because I'm expressing my concerns because of the angels. There's only one context for that. Yeah. Apparently in the back of Paul's mind, he's like, you better get this under control. You better watch what you're doing. You better again, wear the appropriate things. You better behave the appropriate way. You want to show that you belong to a man, you belong to your husband, you're going to be modest, you're going to control your sexuality, your sexual behavior, because if you don't, we've seen what can result from that. You're being watched, pun intended. Okay, so in Paul's mind, this was a concern for him. To us, it's this most throwaway, bizarre, what in the world does that have to do with anything? But again, if you're reading it through those eyes, everything in the chapter makes sense. In terms of what we do today, I have Mennonites, in my family. I'm not going to go tell them, hey, hey, let me tell you what the head covering is really about. I'm not going to, look, and one of them is a pastor too. It's like, look, if this is what you want to do, and your teaching point is modesty, whatever, go ahead. That's a good idea. You're fine there. But again, it has quite a different context than what you'd think. The baptism thing you've heard about before, reading the book. The fourth part here. See how I'm doing on time. Okay, I'm doing pretty well. In the book of Revelation, I have 2 chapters here that go through Revelation, and again, just pick out maybe 3 or 4 items that specifically link back to the Watcher story. The one chapter is about, again, this transgression of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the Antichrist. Now, what I do in this chapter, just going to give you a sweeping overview here, is I summarize the Second Temple Jewish profile of what they expected as from a Messiah. And also, in turn, what they expected about the great messianic enemy Because in their mind, there's Messiah, okay? He's going to come at the end of days and all this stuff. He's going to get rid of the oppression. Well, he has an enemy. So to a Jew, what did that enemy look like? How did they think about it? Again, this great messianic enemy. There are certain things about the enemy's profile that in Jewish texts, again, of this period, were linked to certain figures in Jewish demonology. One of the main ones is Belial. It's also spelled as Beliar in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The belief was that the great enemy of the Messiah, catch the reasoning, since the Messiah was the Son of God, the Son of the Most High, again, this divine Davidic figure, therefore there were Jews who speculated that his enemy would also either be the incarnation of or under the control of Belial, who was one of the Dead Sea Scroll terms for Satan. There were also, though, other Jews who thought, well, okay, it could be like an incarnation of Satan or something like that. And that's very familiar to us, the way, sort of Antichrist thinking is popularized. That's the normal one, again, for our day and age. But there are other texts that thought, well, no, wait a minute. Maybe it's not the incarnation of Satan himself. Maybe it's the incarnation of one of the fallen watchers. Because there are certain ways that the great enemy is described that link back into the Greek story, classical Greek story of the Titans, which again, if you're familiar with the story of the Titans, and I go through this in the chapter, there are very explicit connections between the Greek Titan story and the Book of Enoch and Genesis 6 language, and just general giant language in the Old Testament transmitted through the Septuagint. One of the ones that I talk about is Belos. This is actually a description from it's either Philo or a text called Eupolemus. He talks about Belos, who was a giant, who was the son of Kronos. Again, if you know anything about the Titans, Kronos is an important Titan, who gets linked, he gets described as the person who built Babylon and the Tower of Babel. And then other Jewish texts link Belos specifically with Nimrod. And so again, here's how I'm asking you to look at this stuff. Again, I'm not presenting this as, oh, this should be our theology of Antichrist now. What I'm saying is that if you were living in the first century and you were having a conversation with a literate Second Temple Jew, and you were talking about the Antichrist, this is going to be part of his conversation. This is how he's going to perceive this great enemy. And there are parts of it that you can trace into the church fathers. By the way, in that chapter on depravity, Irenaeus and Tyler Stewart would be buddies, because Irenaeus also traced human depravity back to Genesis 6 and not just Genesis 3. And again, he's a famous church father. But Irenaeus also tracked on this. He refers to, when he's discussing 666 in his comments about that passage in Revelation 13, he gives a couple speculations for what the number might mean. One of them is Teitan. Teitan by gematria equates out, spells out in Numbers 666. Teitan was one of the words for the Titans. And again, he's getting this from his acquaintance with Second Temple Jewish material. And he goes into the Titan story himself. So Irenaeus is a famous church father that very evidently had taken the time to read lots of this stuff, had probably lots of conversations with Jews or Jewish converts. And again, that helped him look at the Old Testament, look at certain things, even in the New Testament, in a different way. And so Irenaeus is an important figure for this whole discussion, because he's a good indication that Mike isn't just making this stuff up. Okay, he's a good indication that Mike is observing what Irenaeus thought and saying, hey, that's kind of interesting. Where did he get that? Where did he come up with that? And you can, again, trace the series of thoughts back in the primary texts. The second chapter of this section is about different things in the book of Revelation. Revelation 9 I talk about because it borrows, it has very, very explicit imagery to the release of the Watchers. Again, connecting that this is the release of the guys from the pit, from the abyss. And there are things in the passage that link back into Enochian material. The 144,000 is kind of interesting. I personally would still put this, I'd need to see more on it. I'd still sort of file this as in Mike's head, sort of speculative, but I put it in the book. There's an article by a guy who, it's actually two people, who published in a journal from South Africa. And it's a very long article, it's very detailed, but here's their view. They pick up on, when the 144,000 are described, they are described as being virgins who have not defiled themselves with women. And you think, well, who cares? So what? I mean, it was okay to get married in the Old and New Testament. Big deal. Well, what they try to demonstrate, and I think, again, they present what I'd call a reasonable circumstantial case for it. At least that's my thinking now. There are certain things in the description in Revelation 7 and Revelation 14 about the 144,000 that link back to Levitical language, the way priests were described. And we know priests were allowed to marry. So the question for them then becomes, why this statement? He believes that the 144,000 are people selected by God to, he doesn't believe they're just humans, okay? They sort of waffle there because they differentiate them from the souls that are martyred under the throne and whatnot. But he thinks they are deliberately there to be representatives of God, and they are presented as, pure in terms of these are heavenly ones who have not defiled themselves with women. In other words, they are the counterparts to the Watchers who just got released. And so they are part of this cosmic Armageddon conflict, the war between gods and men. Okay. Again, I think they build a good circumstantial case for it. I'm not completely persuaded of it yet. But I thought it was worth putting in. The Antichrist from Dan tradition. This is also the 144,000. Oh, there's 12,000 from every tribe. What could be simpler? Yeah, until you count the tribes. Until you actually look at the tribes that are missing. Okay. Okay. There's Ephraim. There's a deal with Ephraim and Manasseh going on there, but the one that's omitted totally is Dan. And so you have this. You have a pretty long church history tradition that the Antichrist would descend from the tribe of Dan. Okay, I don't believe that the point is the tribe of Dan. I think the point is the region of Dan, which is in Bashan. Same name. Okay, so that, again, in the chapter I talk about, well, if we were thinking region instead of tribe, where would that lead us? Because it's Bashan, it's the place of the serpent, in the Old Testament. Talk a little bit about Gog and Armageddon. Again, Gog is the great enemy from the north. Okay, if you remember Unseen Realm, what is it about the north that's important? Saphon. It's the domain of Baal. Okay, that's not a coincidence. Again, to cast Gog in that language, and I do a little bit about. There's a reason I think why Gog has never been identified successfully with a historical person, either in antiquity or currently, because I think the point is not to direct our attention to a specific person. It's to direct our attention, again, to cosmic evil that will control whoever this Antichrist person is. And so I talk a little bit about that. And if you do that, again, you connect it back to Bashan, and then I go into connections between Gog and the Rephaim. Well, how in Gog are the Rephaim connected? Well, if Gog is coming from, the other parts of the earth, Saphon, and if the Antichrist guy is coming from the same place, that's also the region of the Rephaim, the giants. Again, you can do the math from the rest of that point. Again, it's not hard to connect the ideas once you get that point of geographical orientation. Cosmic north, region of Bashan geographically. And there are specific, again, links to the Titans and one particular Titan, Typhon. Again, there's a whole article on how Daniel 11 is sort of this chronology of the Antichrist that we get, how Daniel 11 tracks on the story of Typhon in Greek, literature, okay, or vice versa, depending on your view of the authorship of Daniel. Okay, there are a number of connections, and why that's important is because the figure of Daniel 11, historically, everybody, whether they think Daniel was written in the 6th century, the 2nd century, everybody agrees that the person who fulfilled all of these things in Daniel 11 already, and will, that'll echo out into a future prophecy, is who? Remember the name? Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the Typhon figure in Greek literature. Again, if you're a literate Second Temple Jew, you're familiar with Hellenistic material, these are not coincidences. They all mean something. They're all part of a matrix of ideas. So it's a way to connect the Antichrist to another one of these Watcher, Titan, giant, supernatural bad guys. And so that's what I do in the chapter. Again, I'm just trying to show you in these 2 chapters how a Second Temple person who had knowledge of this material, how they would read Revelation. Not how Tim LaHaye reads it, okay? Or anybody else, Ritterboss or whoever. How would a Second Temple Jew read it? What thoughts would they think? What would pop out of their mouth in discussion if you had that guy in your small group study on Revelation? What he's going to be talking about is just going to frighten everybody else in the room. Okay? Because he is just on a totally different track. Because he has lots of this stuff floating around his head. And the last thing is the lake of fire, again, which if you follow the podcast, we did an episode on the lake of fire. And that language comes really explicitly out of Enoch. Lake of fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Okay, this is where they're sent. They're sent to the abyss. Who's sent there? Well, the only ones we know that were actually sent there are the Watchers, and who else do we find there in the Old Testament? The Rephaim. Again, these things are not coincidences. They're not just random occurrences in the text. You have people, John writing Revelation, hooking you back into the Old Testament, hooking you back into Second Temple literature that he assumes you know. If you're literate, you know this. I don't have to spell everything out for you. Our problem is we don't know that stuff because we haven't read it. We can have it, we can read it, but the book here, again, we'll just end with that, is kind of an effort to, take 10 chapters of that stuff. And it's a little wider net than that. But anything that scholars would think is Enochian, and try to get that in your head, and it's like, okay, now let's go to these New Testament places and just see what pops out to you. Again, how you would parse it if you were thinking this. So that's the book. How did I do on? Hey, I still have 4 minutes on my. Okay, let's take a break and then we can do Q&A. So it gets overwhelming. So if I know I'm not going to use something, and I tend to only look we might as well just throw this in there. The question is this the Mike Heiser version of Logos that has all the books? And no. I don't know how many are in here, but I really make an effort to only look at peer-reviewed material. So I've actually done a few things to tweak my software to eliminate like popular titles and stuff like that. It's not perfect, but I do that as well to sort of winnow search results. I mean, I'm still going to get thousands of hits depending on what I search for. But I've made my own collections. If you have the software, I'll just give you a for instance. If I right-click on Mari here. Oh, come on. Oh, let's see here. Oh, let's do it this way. You can see it better. Okay, if I open up a search and I want to search for Mari, and I'm in basic search, I can search for, since my own book is open somewhere here in the desktop, I could search for that, but what I've done is I've made my own collections, like all my Greek reference grammars, all the way down the line, so that I can run a search against all of them at once, or I can try to narrow it in a specific corpus or a specific kind of book. Like my commentaries, again, what I've loaded into the commentary collection is, all the major, scholarly sets. So it's just a way for me to try to winnow search results, because it gets overwhelming pretty quickly. And I'm not a search wizard. I'm too lazy, I guess, to use all the little Boolean operators and the brackets, and I'd mess it up somewhere. Yeah, you're laughing. I'd mess it up somewhere. Okay, who has a question? Go ahead.
Was Gilgamesh the same as Nimrod or Osiris?
The question is, thank you. I'm supposed to repeat the questions. The question is, was Gilgamesh the same as Nimrod and Osiris? No. They all sort of get lumped into discussions about, wrongly, they get lumped into discussions like for dying and rising gods in the ancient Near East. And there's nothing like that said about Nimrod. Okay, Gilgamesh gets thrown into that with Osiris because Gilgamesh was searching for everlasting life. Well, that's a lot different than this dying and rising thing, but unfortunately, a lot of these major ancient literary, characters and characters from the Bible get sort of dumped into the same drawer. So you got to be careful. A lot of the analogies people think they are striking. Okay, they might find a point of similarity between these figures, but what they're not telling you is the other 10 points where they disagree. So that's something you got to be mindful of. Go ahead.
So Psalm 19 you referenced. The first half of it seems to be about stuff about the heavens.
Yep.
And the second half seems to be a lot about the Torah.
Yep.
And I was wondering, is there some connection between the heavens and the Torah that they're making, or that's there that we in our current worldview wouldn't see? Question.
Sure. Yeah. The question is there a relationship between the two halves of Psalm 19? Because the first half, looks at the heavens as a source point for wisdom, and the second half is really about the Torah, about the law. Again, this answer isn't unique to me, but I think, I think that they are both viewed as sources of revelation, sources of wisdom. And if I could use this analogy, when you're talking about the heavens, you're talking about general revelation. When you're talking about the Torah, you're talking about special revelation. Okay, if you've had any sort of biblical training, the terms general revelation and special revelation should mean something to you. General revelation is what scholars talk about, of what we can learn about God and His ways and His nature through creation. Okay, special revelation gets that label because God is specifically telling us things about Himself that we couldn't learn from the first group. And so He moves people to write things down, through inspiration. That special revelation usually gets labeled, well, that's what we call the Bible. It's special, it's particular. So I think Psalm 19, again, that paradigm is a useful one for looking at the Psalm and saying, okay, we can learn some things about what God is, who God is and what He's up to in the heavens, but we also need the Torah. And for a Jew, they wouldn't look at them as competing systems. They would look at them as cooperative, consistent sources of revelation. They just serve different purposes. One is more limited than the other. One is more particular than the other. So, anybody else? Yeah.
So the book of Enoch was in Genesis time frame, but we think it was written in the Second Temple period by somebody. So, was it just bits and pieces that were handed down and they?
This is a really good question because I know.
I'm trying
Thank you. The Book of Enoch, it appears to have been written in the Second Temple period, but it's set in the pre-flood, flood period. So, how do we talk about its date? I guess is a good way to summarize that. When you talk about a book, you have to clarify whether you're talking about manuscript data or whether you're talking about the ideas in a particular book. In terms of manuscript data, the oldest stuff we have for Enoch comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So people, scholars who are really focused on this area are pretty comfortable dating Enoch roughly 2nd century BC, so 200 and more recent, 200 to 1, down to year 0 if you want to use that terminology. And that's because there were Aramaic fragments of Enoch found at Qumran. So there is no textual evidence older than that for the book. There's a lot of Greek evidence that comes from the same period. Most of the book is preserved in Greek. The Aramaic is fragmentary. The only place the entire book is preserved is in Ethiopic, which is quite late for us. If you're talking manuscripts, you're talking the late Middle Ages for the whole book, getting up into the early modern period. But everybody, again, because you have the Qumran stuff, everybody figures, well, the book at one time it existed at least, in the 2nd century BC, and ostensibly in Aramaic. Now, if you're talking about the content of the book, which we spent a lot of time here, really specific points of content in Enoch are much, much older than that. So there's a literary history, a manuscript history, and there's a conceptual, thematic content history. So, usually when people ask the question, they're talking about manuscripts, the actual document itself. So what we have for that, that's pretty old. It's over 2,000 years, but it's not going back into the Noahic period, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, kind of on that, when I was studying the Book of Enoch, I heard this talk about the tradition of the Book of Noah, going back like Enoch would draw from another text. Is there anything to that? Or?
There are books of Noah. Is there anything? The question is there anything to the tradition about a book of Noah? There are books of Noah. They've been published. Again, they're considered part of the Second Temple corpus. Why? Why is everything lined up there? It's because of Qumran. It's because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's our oldest repository for stuff. So if you find a portion of a book in there, that's where the wall, that's where you hit the wall. So Noah material, again, is it's going to have its own. You can buy all the books of Noah stuff, in an anthology and an edition. Some will group it in Enochian, the larger category of Enochian material for obvious reasons. It's the flood and the Watchers and stuff like that. But you don't really gain any chronological ground, with that. And it gets its name because it's about Noah. It's about the flood. And again, it doesn't mean that somebody dug this up on Ararat and then just kept it. No, it refers to the content. In the back row, go ahead.
The Rephaim being post-flood, was there a second wave of Watchers falling after?
Yeah, we're never. Thank you. See, I'm really terrible at this. I'm terrible at repeating questions. Rephaim after the flood. Let's just broaden it. Giants after the flood. Was there a second wave of this? In terms of the biblical text, we're never told anything like that. As far as another period or event of cohabitation. That's one of the three options for why they're there. And in Unseen Realm, I sketch out the three explanations for how you get giant clans after the flood. And in short terms, one is you view either Noah or Noah's sons or the daughters married to those sons as somehow being a carrier, for lack of a better word. And for some ancient Jews, that was their answer, because you will find texts that say that. You'll find there's one text that describes Noah as a giant. Again, it tells you that when you find a text like that, it tells you they're thinking about the question, and so they feel like they've got to come up with some answer to it. So Noah was like fathered by one of them, those who shall not be named. That. You'll find another text where Noah's parents are having an argument. His dad Lamech. This is the Genesis Apocryphon. It's a very famous text. Lamech goes to his wife, who's actually given a name in the text, Bitanosh or Batanosh. Both of them mean daughter of man. But he comes to her and says, well, I heard about all this Watcher stuff going on, and I just want to make sure that this kid's mine. And they have an argument. She's like, don't you remember the other night when, So, again, it tells you that they're thinking about the question. So that's one option. Another option is you view the flood not as a truly global event, but a regional event, regional or localized event. And, you can have that view and still say to the biblical writer, this was all the earth because all the nations of the earth are listed in Genesis 10. To us, that's regional, but to them, it was comprehensive. Whatever. But you have to somehow then have ancestors, Nephilim ancestors, survive the flood in some region of the known world, and people who take that view will usually go to the Aegean Sea. Okay, because of the Philistines. The Philistines are actually members, we know this from Egyptian texts. The Philistines are a group of people from a larger group of people called the Sea Peoples, who were seafaring peoples from the Aegean. They come to the mainland, of not only Egypt but Canaan on boats. That's how they get there. If you've read The Portent, I go into some of this stuff, to strike a fictional trajectory about Goliath. But since Goliath was the son of Rapha, which you can say, well, that means he's a Rephaim, and he's a Philistine, and they're one of the sea peoples, that maybe something survived here. Jeremiah talks about the Philistines coming from Caphtor, which is one of the Aegean islands and stuff like that. And again, people know where the Philistines came from. The third option is to take Genesis 6:4 and translate it a little bit differently. And this is legitimate, this is possible. If you go to Genesis 6:4, I'll try not to have a grammar spasm here, but it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. Now, when there, you can take that particle, and because of the verb form that follows it, being an imperfect verb form, you can translate it this way. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward, whenever the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, they bore children to them. You'll actually see this verse referenced in Hebrew reference grammars about this particular use of the imperfect with this particle. So that's possible. Now, should we do that? Is that what it really means to say? Well, who knows, because it's a translation choice. And that's all you got. You just sort of pick one of those three, answers to the question, why we get them on the other side of the flood, and that's, targeting these Rephaim. Because you get Rephaim in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. It's very clear. They're described as being very tall. They're referred to as Anakim. The Anakim, according to Numbers 13, come, quote, from the Nephilim. I mean, it's point blank, what's there. So those are the paths you have to follow, to answer that question. Go ahead.
If it is the third option, do you think that would have been a second incursion by different watchers, or would that have been the first group that somehow escaped out of the abyss?
Yeah, I don't think there's any indication that the original offenders get anywhere except where they're always described as being in prison. So you would have to have the same sort of transgression of heaven and earth is what it comes down to. And there's no indication of that specifically. I mean, you could look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 about because of the angels, and you could say, well, Paul apparently thought this was a possibility. Okay, you could say that, but Paul's not making a statement that it did. It's just he's like, we just don't ever want to see this happen again. You know, it's that kind of thing. So you could take that and say, well, for Paul maybe it was a possibility, but it's not a real answer to the question. Go ahead.
When it comes to authorship of Genesis 1 through 11, I understand, given the polemic content of Mesopotamia, most people believe it was written in the captivity. Given how, though, during the Exodus and during the conquest narrative, the children of Israel were encountering the Amorites and whatnot, we know from the description of Og's bed and everything, they had this Babylonian content coming in. Is there any possibility that, I mean, what do you think about the idea that there was enough cross-cultural content there, contamination, if you will, that could Moses have written Genesis 1 through 11 based on that and still be a Babylonian?
Yeah, the question is really, when do I think Genesis 1 to 11 was written? Because of the heavy Mesopotamian influence there in those 11 chapters. And could Moses have had that information? That's a short way of saying it. Well, I would never want to say that Moses couldn't have had the information. Moses is an Egyptian. He's raised in the court of Pharaoh, Akkadian during the New Kingdom, which would be the Mosaic era by either chronology, either later or older chronology. Akkadian in that period, which was the literary language of Babylonian stuff, Mesopotamian stuff, was kind of like English is today. It was the lingua franca. It was the language of international correspondence. And we know that for sure because of the Tel El Amarna letters. Okay, these are letters, it's a correspondence. I'm sure you've heard of the El Amarna letters. They're actually a correspondence between the Pharaoh of Egypt and his underlings in Canaan, the people he's put in charge. And they're written in Akkadian. They're not written in Egyptian. So we know that for sure. So if Moses, again, was being groomed to be a pharaoh or a diplomat or some other high office in the household of Pharaoh, I think it's reasonable to assume he probably had to learn Akkadian. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Again, it's still an argument from silence because we don't actually know what he read. The question then becomes, okay, if he could read it, what is he reading? There's no evidence in Egypt that you have libraries from Mesopotamia in Egypt. You have lots of correspondence. You got lots of letters and documents and land deeds, and wouldn't that have been awful, to spend your youth, deciphering economic texts, like somebody's bill to somebody for 10 sheep, treaties, I guess, would be better, you got to learn that stuff. But so we don't really know, again, what he would have, been reading. On the other side, there's so much that is overtly polemic in Genesis 1 to 11 against Mesopotamian material that it's really next to impossible. And in fact, it would just violate what you actually see in the text to say that whoever wrote Genesis 1 through 11, or at least this part of Genesis 1 through 11, was not looking at a Mesopotamian text specifically to respond to things in that text. Because it's more than like deity names and stuff like that. It's even grammar in some places, where they want the literate person to know what they are tracking on and what they're objecting to, how they are subverting the Mesopotamian material that they assume the reader knows. It gets very detailed. So there are places you just have to have that in front of you, unless I guess you memorized cuneiform or something. I mean, again, that's possible. There were people who did that. So it's a back and forth, for me. I think the more reasonable explanation is that Genesis 1 through 11 was either composed or edited during the exile with this strategy in mind. But I won't say that it's impossible that Moses, could have known that and had access to the material. We don't see a path, but that doesn't mean there wasn't one. So, go ahead.
First, a confession: I have not read the answer.
Gasp.
So you might have covered this, the answer to this question
Yep.
in there, but I'm curious about your view on the historical basis of Genesis 6 and connected to the Watchers. So it seems like what you're presenting is that the Watchers' extrapolation in Enoch is giving us more information about what's happening in the author's intent in Genesis 6. And so we have there the sons of God and the daughters of men, and it's always been, a question about what is meant by the sons of God. And so you've presented a possible solution here, which seems to me, and this is where I want the clarification, it seems to me that you're saying that the sons of God mean some angelic beings that become corporeal somehow on the earth. And so my question, first of all, is that what you're presenting? And secondly, metaphysically, what does that mean, since angelic beings are spirit beings? What does it mean for a spirit being to have a body and physically copulate and produce human offspring? How does that work?
Yeah, I think they probably picked that up because my butt's right here. Okay.
I was speaking loudly.
Yeah. I'll take the second part first. The idea that spirit beings can take on flesh and do things that flesh does is a very biblical idea. God himself, even before the incarnation, takes on bodily form. Genesis 18 is the classic example where God, Yahweh, shows up with two men who we find out in Genesis 19 are actually angels. They're called angels in Genesis 19. So the three of them come and visit Abraham. They look like men. They're embodied. They sit down. They have a meal. They eat together. I mean, it says all these things. The two angels, of course, grab Lot and pull him into the house. And you have instances where divine beings become corporeal, and they are truly corporeal. Again, it's not incarnation. I want to be careful there. Theologians would use words like embodiment for that. But the assumption is that, okay, they don't have to eat, but they can. Spirit beings don't have to do anything that a body does. But when they inhabit a body, it's a body. It does what bodies do. The whole trajectory seems to indicate, and this is pretty consistent when you get angel talk in Scripture. And in the book, I spent spend 3 chapters talking about the 2 Yahweh figures in the Old Testament. The visible Yahweh appears to Israelites as a man, and that doesn't mean the invisible Yahweh is there and not anywhere else. There's still God, both in heaven and on earth. On earth, he's this human being. God as man is not a New Testament invention. It comes from the Old Testament. And it's part of what becomes Trinitarian thinking. And I'm a standard Trinitarian. But you get the impression that when a divine being comes to earth, especially if it's not God or not the Father, that the required form of dress is flesh. There are very few. In fact, it would be hard for me to come up with one where an angel speaks to anybody in the Bible and they're not in human form. I mean, I know God does that. I can't. Off the top of my head, I can't really think of an angel ever doing that. You have to be able. The person has to be able to process who's in their presence and what they're talking with. So God even does that at some times. So in terms of the precedent for it, it's there. Now you say, well, why include the notion of copulation in the book? This is why I wanted to make clear to people that there are 2 views of Genesis 6 that are supernatural in orientation. One is sexual cohabitation. The other one takes the language in Genesis 6 as euphemistic for other gods, other sons of God, other divine beings, as intentionally raising up human populations who in the biblical story ultimately turn out to be the peoples that are trying to exterminate the Israelites when they get into the land. You say, well, how would that work? It's the Abraham and Sarah analogy. It's very clear that God did something to enable Abraham and Sarah to have children. There is no hint of any sexual contact between God and Sarah. But the text is equally clear that they were supernaturally enabled to have children when they were well beyond the age of doing so. So the assumption in view number 2 is that divine beings can do something, with people to enable them to have children. And so maybe that's what Genesis 6 is talking about, minus the sexual language. And I go back to the first part of the question. I take the supernatural view because I don't want to disagree with Peter and Jude, because they're inspired and I'm not. Peter and Jude very plainly, explicitly, I frankly, and I know and I'll be as bold to say, I know the sophistry involved to try to get them to say something they're not saying. I know how that's done because I'm a scholar and scholars do that sort of thing. They refer to the angels that sinned, in 2 Peter and Jude. These angels are in prison until the time of the end. There is no angelic sin, not only in the Old Testament, but in the entirety of the Bible. There is no plural angelic sin anywhere except for Genesis 6. So you either have to say Peter and Jude are making one up, or they're thinking about Genesis 6. It's the only place you can go. And since they throw in the detail about the imprisonment, which you won't find in the Old Testament directly, you'll get it obliquely in underworld passages that have, guess who, the Rephaim in them. You'll get it there obliquely. But the only place that does say that directly is the Enochian material, which again is tracking on both the Mesopotamian story and Genesis 6. And ultimately the Mesopotamian story is what Genesis 6 is written to respond to. So essentially you're trapped. If you want to get your theology from the text, you either have to affirm the supernatural nature of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, or you say Peter and Jude got it wrong. That's your choice. Now people don't... I know. That's his whole point.
Yeah.
So, people don't like to hear this. It was one of the things, again, when we were talking about publishing Unseen Realm. It's like, this is going to cause a controversy because, frankly, people don't want to hear that. Christians don't want to hear that. Christians, this is why I say and it's not anything bad about people. Again, it's just that we're taught to be selectively supernatural. Okay, well, we accept God, we accept Trinity, we accept Satan, because we got to have that, or else why even have a discussion about Christianity? But then why exclude this other stuff? I'll tell you why, because it's just stinking weird. Okay, that's why we're excluding it. Peter and Jude didn't do that. Irenaeus didn't do that. Lots of other, famous figures that you could go to in church history didn't do that. I don't use guys from church history as an argument, not because I view them as foes, but they're not from the actual context. They're later. I think they're doing the best they can with what they have. But I'm well aware that that's controversial. I don't really care what view it takes. As far as the metaphysics of it, like how does that work? I don't know, because I'm not a god. I'm not a deity. I'm me. Okay, I can't tell you. I kind of use the phrase a lot. I try not to put the words God and can't into too many sentences. I also try not to sound like I know what a divine being can or cannot do. I have no idea. Okay, because biblical theology, I think, requires us to affirm the reality of a supernatural world where such beings exist. I got to go with that and then wonder about, well, what is it like to be one of them? Like what can they actually do? What are their limitations? I don't know the answers to any of those questions. Go ahead.
As a follow-up on Peter and Jude, the standard explanation I've heard before is that Peter and Jude were referring to First Enoch as mythology. So similar to how a modern preacher might say, well, you know how Darth Vader interacted with so-and-so, well, that's a lesson that should show us this. Not treating the Star Wars story as historical in any way, but as a convenient contemporary example. Why do you think that's not the right way to interpret Peter and Jude when it refers to these things?
Because they were predisposed to believing in a supernatural world. It's everywhere in all their texts. We like that explanation because it lets us not believe certain things while we affirm other things. If you're an ancient person, you don't have that tension at all. There's no tension to dismiss a supernatural claim because of something else. They were consistently, looking at, the supernatural world. And what people who make the claim don't realize is that there are lots of not only would that put Peter and Jude out of step with everybody else in their contemporary world, it would also make them inconsistent in their use of the material. Because Peter and Jude are going to quote other parts of Enoch that nobody bickers about.
That's right.
So it's an inconsistent hermeneutic from the get-go. But most people don't realize that because they haven't read the Enochian material and they don't see where else it shows up. Again, the value of scholars, whether they believe anything about the supernatural or not, is the fact that there's been a pile of scholarship showing, and again in the book here I'm trying to distill, parts of it. There's a pile of scholarship that shows how influential is not the right word, but how transparent a lot of Enochian stuff is throughout the New Testament. A lot of it is not very spectacular or interesting. Just parables and analogies to this or that. It's nothing that would really invite much discussion. But like in the appendix to the book, there are dozens of places, dozens and dozens, where Enoch and other pseudepigraphical material is cited or alluded to by New Testament writers. And just going with that analogy like preachers do, that's very normal. You have it in your head, it's going to connect with your audience because your audience knows what you're talking about, and you use that to illustrate some point or articulate some point. That's what they're doing with all of this stuff. And to pick 2 or 3 passages out in Peter and Jude and say, they didn't really mean it here. They weren't being serious about it here, not knowing that there's all this other stuff over here that nobody ever talks about, is really inconsistent. So that's how I would approach that. There was another hand over. Go ahead.
The word blameless in his generations, and is that his bloodline, or what is that?
Let's just go to the question is about the line blameless in his generations. If I can find my mouse here. Okay, the word here is dor in Hebrew. I've got to switch my search here. We're not going to find Hebrew in the New Testament. There we go. There's like one exception here. I think I can remember it down here in the Book of Numbers somewhere. Dor is the term you would use. Let's just go down here. Just park there for a while. Dor is the term you would use of generation in terms of like your timeline or your epoch. Like if we talk about the generation of the 60s, okay, that's not referring to lineal genealogical descent. It's referring to sort of a time period. Dor is the typical word for that, not lineal descent. Lineal descent is typically toledot. These are the generations of, and then you get the grocery list. Okay. There are exceptions, though. There are one or two places where door, right here, Numbers 18:23, but the Levites shall do the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetuate statute throughout your generations. Now, if he's speaking to the Levites there, he's referring to the Levites and their descendants. This is their job. Okay, that sort of thing. So there it could refer to lineal descent. Down here, until all the generation. That could either be time period or again, people's bloodlines. I mean, there are one or two that could sort of go either way. Generations, plural, again, referring to the people themselves, not just a specific time period. There are a handful of references where door could refer to lineal descent. And so going back to Genesis 6:9, if I were the writer of this text and I wanted you, the reader, to think of lineal descent, I would not use door because you might be misled. I would use toledot. But if I did use door, and that's what we have here, there's still a possibility I could have been thinking that. So you can't eliminate it, you can just make it a question of probability. It most likely does not refer to that. Question, yes.
This is a kind of a couple questions bundled into one. In your second science fiction book, you talked about the gematria of the number 153 as being the sons of God.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could give a little discussion.
There's a spoiler. Go ahead, the cat's out of the bag now. I should have stopped you right there.
I was wondering if you could give a discussion or give an overview of what you currently think Jesus was talking about, or the writer was talking about with the 153 fish that were caught. And also, can you put a number into Logos Bible software and get something like that?
Yeah. You're going to, the second question first. The question is, discuss a little bit the number 153 at the end of the book of John and the meaning of that, and then, can you search Logos essentially for numbers? You're dependent on, your initial search would be dependent on whether the book or the translation uses the numbers in the translation or whether it writes them out. Once you had a hit, then you could look at the word number underneath the actual text and construct a search that way. So you'd have to do a couple things to make sure that you got everything.
Well, what I mean is, could I put the number 153 in some tool, and could it generate every Hebrew word that gematria
No,
adds up?
we don't have a gematria creator in the software. Gematria one way or the other. I would be astonished, though. In fact, I'm pretty sure that there are such things on the web. I don't know how good they are.
That's why.
Yeah, I'm sure that I've seen one, but I just don't know if it works two directions or one. And it's actually tricky because if let's just take 666. The number is not only famous for being 666, but some texts of the book. We'll get back to the 153. I'm not trying to deflect attention. Okay. The number 666 is famous, for obvious reasons. But there are some manuscripts of the Greek New Testament that do not read 666 as the number of the beast. They read 616. Now that's important because it's sort of what makes a lot of scholars think that Nero is the figure John is thinking about, or the archetype, a new archetype for the Antichrist. I actually don't buy that. I think the best archetype is still Antiochus IV because of Daniel 11. But anyway, the reason why Nero is important is because depending on how you spell his name, whether you use Aramaic or Latin, and then his name actually had variant spellings, that is the only name in antiquity that can account for both numbers by gematria. But you have to sort of cheat by the way you spell it, to make it work. So if you're creating a gematria tool, you also have to account. you'd have to at least tell people, make sure your spelling is correct and what language you're using and all that, because it's gonna affect the results ultimately. Now the 153, the view I have in the portent is the view I take. By gematria, 153 reverts back out into Hebrew as the sons of God. So if you're in that passage in John, where they're out there fishing and they drag up the 153 fish, and again the context is, being fishers of men and all that stuff. To have a reference back to the sons of God, I think is significant, because the disciples are told to go out and win people to the Lord, to make disciples of all nations. What they're doing is they're gathering God's children, the sons of God, the children of God. So a gematria reference for 153, I think, makes really good sense there. There are other gematria references that, and people argue about that one. There's a couple other things you could do with it. But given the context, which is typically how I judge gematria, again, if I were the writer, is this consistent with the context of what I'm writing? And in that instance, it is. So I think we should assign a reasonable level of probability that this is what John's trying to do. John also wrote the book of Revelation, 666. I mean, he's familiar with gematria. Okay, he knows what this is. Now, there are some esotericists that take the number of 153 and they go back to Pythagoras with it, and it has to do with esoteric, symbolism and whatnot. Even if you take that view, just as a rabbit trail here, and say, oh, this is Pythagorean, predates the New Testament, and some guy stole it from Pythagoras. Look, what would the point be then? Jesus is greater than Pythagoras. Well, duh. Okay, I mean, no kidding. But Pythagoras was a major figure. You have the the Platonists and the whole Platonic school of thought, and Jesus would be being cast as a greater teacher than this esoteric tradition. I mean, you can go that way, but I think, again, for a Jewish audience, it makes more sense to tap back into Old Testament theology. This whole idea of believers, people who are members of God's family being referred to that way. So that makes more sense to me. The dove passage, I didn't put this into Unseen Realm, but I don't think I did. I can't remember half the time what's in there. But the passage at Jesus' baptism where the Spirit of God descends upon Jesus as a dove. I believe it or not, scholars are sort of mystified by that, because there's no reference to, people think, okay, well that, like a dove, that goes back to Genesis 1:3, where the Spirit, the Ruach, the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. And the verb there is a participle that's used elsewhere of an eagle in Deuteronomy 32. And again, all that's true, but it's not the word for dove. So people are looking at that like, well, it's probably not a reference back to Genesis 1, or they would have used some word that is found in that passage. And I think that's correct. But if you take the word dove and you do gematria on it, it has the same equivalent as the Greek letters alpha and omega together. I don't think that's a coincidence. Because John, okay, we're still in the Gospel of John here. I mean, is the same guy who does the alpha and omega thing. Again, I just think that he's just putting breadcrumbs in there. For the people who know what he's doing, he's laying the breadcrumbs out. So even at the baptism, I am alpha and omega, the beginning and the end. So, to me that makes sense. At least I consider it a strong possibility, that's what we could be looking at in certain passages. I don't think it's widespread in Scripture. I would never recommend we use gematria as a hermeneutic, but there are places where people have considered that, and it packs a punch, when it does.
I've heard this before, and I was curious if you know if it was true or not. Was there, at the time of that passage being written, like 153 or 154 known nations?
Yeah, I've never come across that. Yeah. If you come across it, I'd like to see it, though. Greg?
My question. We have the Genesis 6, then you have the flood that wipes everything out.
Mhm.
And then we have the conquest narratives where what we learned from your book is, you know, Joshua was told to wipe out certain people groups because of the Nephilim. Okay?
Mhm.
So those are these sons of God, daughters of men incidences. But there's another passage where he wipes everybody out except for a couple survivors, and that's Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mhm.
But there's no connection, biblically speaking, I think. Is there intertestamental literature that has some kind of a Genesis 6 flavor to that Sodom and Gomorrah event? And the second
Yeah.
question, what's with this whole pillar of salt thing?
Yeah. Yeah, the questions about about the Sodom and Gomorrah incident, is there some connection between that and the Genesis 6 and then the pillar of salt thing? I have not come across a specific connection to that other than, you know, the reference to angels there. So, again, as of right now, I don't see one. I just haven't come across one. You know, I can't say I've looked at it as much as I've looked at other things, but I would think that if there's something there, I probably would have come across it. But you know, who knows? Pillar of salt thing. I mean, I tend to read that pretty straightforwardly. I don't think there's anything, you know, terribly cryptic in it. I do think that, you know, it's, you know, do we have to view Lot's wife as turning into a pillar of salt, you know, or is this sort of a play on words, you know, to make us think of the Dead Sea later on? Is that really what you're getting at? There will be some who argue the latter, that the language there is sort of deliberate to make us think of this specific geographical region. Well, the problem with that is scholars don't really know conclusively where Sodom and Gomorrah were. One possible location is the Dead Sea, which is associated with the salt and all that. So, you know, there might be something to that. But I tend to just, you know, read it as, you know, for what it says. This is the way God decided to punish her, so that she would become an emblem, you know, of disobedience. And I don't know. There might be something more to it. I just haven't come across it yet.
Well, doesn't Luke 17 kind of link the days of Noah and the Sodom and Gomorrah story?
Go ahead.
Well, it says, you know, just as it was in the days of Noah, so will be the days of the Son of Man, you know, marrying and stuff. And then right after that, Jesus says, the Lot and the Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, that's my wife, by the way. We'll talk about that later. No, I think the connection there is the angels, and the reason angels had a significant role to play in eschatology generally, and so I think that's why those instances are grouped together, because they both concern angelic presence, you know, in judgment, specifically in judgment. You know, I talk a little bit about this in the again the last section of the book, because there are passages in the Old Testament that very specifically link in conjunction with the day of the Lord. Again, it's an important biblical concept. The day of the Lord is, again, the time of the end, where all the enemies of God get punished and all the righteous, you know, they turn out to be, you know, rewarded in either in this life or the next, and so on and so forth. Everything wrong is made right. Everything right, you know, stands, you know, for what it is. So we tend to think of that in terms of the way we're taught about Armageddon, this big battle, you know, on the earth. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but there are passages like Isaiah 34, Isaiah 24, that refer to this final conflict as involving angels, divine beings. Okay, the stars of heaven, you know, the holy ones. Okay, come with the Lord, you know, down to earth to punish not only the host on earth, but the host of heaven in heaven. And it's a reference to the fact that when God cleans house, this isn't the only house that gets cleaned. In other words, the earthly sphere is going to be judged, but also the spiritual world is going to get the same treatment. And so for that reason, you have angels often referenced with this time of the end kind of stuff because they have a specific role to play. And it's judgment. Genesis 6, Sodom and Gomorrah, that sort of thing. But anything more specific, going back to the first 4 verses of Genesis 6, I haven't come across anything there yet. But, yes, sir.
So, expanding on what you just mentioned, divine intervention. What are your thoughts about that with regards to the timeline that you've expressed in both your writings as well as some of your studies as well?
What do you mean by
In other
timeline?
words, nothing by accident, coincidence, happenstance.
Mhm.
Everything for a purpose of reason and function. How does that carry through into your writings?
Are you talking about the theme of providence, just generally? Yeah. The question is how does sort of the providence, I guess, in general, and maybe in the flow of events, factor into what I write about? It's a big deal in the fiction because one of the things I want to communicate in the fiction is I think a better sense, a greater sense of providence, just generally. We have this impression that God only shows up in the spectacular. Oh, we prayed for this person and they got healed. God showed up. Whereas, we prayed for this person and they didn't get healed. Where was God? Again, we talk this way as though God is only around and only doing something when there's something spectacular going on. I think that is a deeply flawed view of God. God is typically in the non-spectacular. I think we don't put enough evidence on the unseen hand. That's typically the way God works. Because again, this is why, and I've brought it up in interviews before, I like movies like It's a Wonderful Life or Mr. Destiny or these things where something in the story changes about a character's life and then you get to see what his life would have been had that moment been different. Yeah, it's the same kind of thing. I like those because I think they teach some good theology. That in this respect, that we often don't think about our lives as being where you are today is a result of many thousands of decisions that you've made and decisions that other people have made, not only that but people you don't know. Because every decision ripples through a countless number of lives and you're caught up in this torrent. Okay, and it matters. And if you've read Unseen Realm, I talk a lot about the concept of imaging and free will and how what you do matters. And this is the way God has built the universe. God hasn't built the universe where he either has to or needs to go in there and just destroy everything to make it work. Okay, that is counter to the biblical model. So again, if we thought of ourselves this way, we might have a more renewed sense of purpose. That what I actually do today is actually going to matter. It might matter in the next 5 minutes after I do it. It might matter 5 years from now. But that isn't my job to know how it matters. My job is just to understand that it does matter and that God will use it because God doesn't we're not robots. He didn't make us this way. We can't image God if everything is predestined. Okay, you cannot be an imager of God if you do not have free will. Okay, this is communicable attributes theology 101. Okay, you can't do that because you cease to be in God's image at that point. It's why God doesn't deal with evil by eliminating. Why doesn't God just eliminate evil? Well, to do that, he'd have to eliminate not only all of us, but everything else in the spiritual world, because everything is derivative. Everything, this is why we get the plurals in Genesis 1. Spiritual beings are created as images of God. He shares his attributes with them. They represent him in their world as we do in our world. We share the communicable attributes of God. Why is there evil? It's because God decided to do that. God decided to not make us robots. He knows what the cost is going to be because he's omniscient. Okay? He knows what the cost is going to be. But he would rather have that cost happen than not have us at all. Those are the choices. So everything is not nailed down. 1 Samuel 23 is the example I like because it's the most clear. I just don't know how you can miss it. Where God foreknows two things that never happen. That tells you immediately that foreknowledge does not necessitate predestination because they didn't happen. If it did necessitate predestination, they would have had to have happened. Again, it's not complicated stuff. It's just, again, we're not really asked to think about a lot of it. So, back to your question, it's like that's how I think, at least how I try to think, of life. What you do is going to ripple out. And God will use other people, he'll use divine beings, he'll use his spirit, and he may actually get into the act himself on occasion. Again, the minimal occasions of the spectacular, he can do that if he wants, but he doesn't need to. And he will influence everything, people, to the end to which he desires. People rebel all the time. The agents he uses can rebel. They do frequently. Okay, God's solution isn't, I'm so frustrated now, I'm just going to destroy everyone. Okay, that isn't the solution. God will work the plan. And things will move inexorably toward the end to which God wants them to go. So in the novels, I try to play with that. Again, I don't want to go into scenes, but there are just scenes where something that happened like 10 years ago that was like completely incomprehensible makes total sense now. And not only does it make sense, but nothing else could have happened here to make this outcome work. Just that kind of thing. I love, to put that sort of thing in fiction because I do think that's the way life actually works. But again, we tend to view God as this vending machine, or this box, that, hey, if I push the button, like the slot machine, if I push the buttons long enough, I'm going to get a jackpot. I'm going to see something work. Okay, that just isn't. It's really deeply flawed. So that's important. And academically, I can discuss passages, but I think the fiction's a little better for that.
It's a great platform.
Yeah. Well, we'll go over here. We'll move this direction. Go ahead.
What is the significance of the sin of Balaam being mentioned in both Peter and Jude when they quote Enoch?
I mean, you do. I know. I'm sorry. What is? This is brutal, isn't it? What is the significance of the sin of Balaam when Peter and Jude mention it? I think there is a broad and perhaps a more narrow reason why it's on their minds. I mean, broadly, it's rebellion. Broadly, there is this sense of this is one of the avenues in the Old Testament. Again, the sin of Balaam is Balaam gets the Israelites to cohabit and have relationships with foreign women, the Moabites, and so on and so forth. And it was something that they were forbidden from doing. That is often connected, broadly speaking, with false teaching, because when you do that, when you marry outside the family of God, you either are exposed to or to make your marriage work or whatever, you bring in the religion, another religion from the outside. So the two broad things are rebellion and then this connection with false teaching. It's one of the reasons why you get false teaching elsewhere talked about in terms of, for lack of a better way of putting it, like mixed marriages and things like this in both testaments. I think more particularly, though, I think there is something to taking both those ideas, the rebellion and then the bad theology, the false teaching, and that those two things are attachable to the sexual transgression of the watchers. I think it's peripheral, but I think that they could be thinking that as well, because this one event basically did these two things over here, if you can follow the reasoning there. So I think that may be lurking in the back of their minds specifically. But if you go back to the actual passage in the Old Testament, you don't have anything specifically in that passage, the Balaam incident, that links back into Genesis 6. You could get there if you focus on the Moabites, the region, and then go to Deuteronomy 2 and 3, because the Amim were the giants in this region, again, that are also called Rephaim, that come from the Anakim and the Nephilim. I mean, you can get there, but it feels a little forced, to go that route, even though you could. So I tend to view it more, again, more of a theme, sort of a conceptual, matrix of ideas there. That Balaam, they belong in the same bucket. They just may not be, linked together specifically. Go ahead.
All right, I just want to clarify, like the Watchers and the Watchers from Genesis 6 and the sons of God, the gods of the nations. They are like different groups.
They're different groups.
Of,
yeah.
like sons of God, right?
Yeah.
So, and then the paranormal activity, like the demonic activity that we have right now. So they're not the Watchers, because they were imprisoned like prior to the flood or during the flood.
It depends which group you're talking about.
Like,
so I'll summarize the question this way. The question was about, demonic activity that we might see now, or again referenced in the Gospels, and the sons of God and the Watchers. I mean, what's up with that? Is this one group or many? You have different groups because you have different rebellions. We have Genesis 3, you got one entity, you have a divine rebellion, the figure we know as Satan, and so on and so forth. Genesis 6, you got a bunch. We're never, Old Testament doesn't give us a number. Other texts, throw numbers around. But you have a divine rebellion there, which is punished by, we're sending you to the abyss, okay? Then you have the third rebellion, which we haven't really talked about today, but I spent a lot of time talking about in the book, and that is what happens at Babel. Where God punishes the nations, he assigns them to sons of God, other lesser Elohim, lesser divine beings than himself, as a punishment. So that's a totally different group. Now, that group is the one that is the orienting point for what scholars call cosmic geography. Different episodes in the Old Testament where things happen that the language is used that a typical deity is associated with a typical place. Okay, Paul is referencing this when he refers to principalities and powers. Paul uses terms that show up in Daniel 10, the princes, the prince of Persia, prince of Greece, all that kind of talk, divine beings that are over the nations and manipulating them and abusing them. Paul's other vocabulary, thrones, dominions, powers, rulers, authorities, they are all terms used of geographical rulership. That is not a coincidence. Paul understands the world of the Gentile perceived through the eyes of God, that these nations are under the dominion of divine beings that he assigned to those nations, but who rebelled. That's what Psalm 82 is about, and are now hostile to him. So we have spiritual warfare in the most explicit sense in all this. But they're a third group. So there's no sense that group has been dealt with or punished or put in the abyss. So they're, for lack of a better way of putting it, they're running around. They're doing their thing. They're abusing the nations. They're abusing the people. They get the people to, do all sorts of things in self-destructive patterns. Again, it's back to Psalm 82. So they're gonna be judged again at the time of the end, which means they can still be active in some sense now. Now, I personally don't assign specific points of geography to them anymore, and that's because the Old Testament story, once you get post-cross, it's no longer about just this entity, Israel, and 70 nations in Genesis 10, it becomes about all the world, now needs to be won back. Jesus is not just the Messiah for Israel, he is the Messiah to the nations. Paul is the apostle to the nations, to the Gentiles. It becomes global on both sides. If you are Christ, you are Abraham's seed and heir according to the promise. This is written to Gentiles in Galatians 3. Okay, the people of God are not just Israelites. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. It has nothing to do with land boundaries. Okay, the people of God are those, Jew or Gentile, who align themselves with Christ, and where they are is where He is. Okay, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered, there I am in your midst. Just this whole theology that cosmic geography now is wherever Christians are, that should be considered holy ground and treated as such and taken, as holy ground, to use the metaphor. Wherever the Spirit of God is not present, because the Spirit of God indwells believers. This is why believers are called collectively and individually the temple. Okay, again, the language is not accidental. This is where the glory is. Okay, wherever it's not, wherever believers are not, that is ground under dominion of somebody else. And so that's the sense. We need to view it in a sort of a collective sense. So in that regard, that whole system created through the events of the Old Testament is still around and still active. But those guys, again, in biblical thinking and in Second Temple Jewish thinking, those are not the demons that Jesus encounters in the Gospels. That's something else. Those are specifically, we saw one passage in Enoch. The demons in the Gospel stories are the disembodied, immaterial part of the dead Nephilim, the dead giant clans. This is why you get Rephaim in the underworld in the Old Testament, to create that linkage. Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 32, Job 26, you see them there. And that thinking went all the way in between the Testaments, where you have lots of texts talking about this is what demons are. This is why demons are called at Qumran bastard spirits. They're bastards because they're mixed. They come from this event back here. This is why the terminology is used. And to telegraph this. But we're not taught this in church. We're not taught demonology in church, I guess for a good reason. This is standard Jewish demonology. I don't really have to look too hard to find it in the text. But all that group and, again, this national stuff, this cosmic geographical stuff, those are the 2 groups that Jesus and the apostles have to deal with. So, you can look at what goes on in the world today, and I trust missionaries I've given divine counsel lectures to like groups of African pastors, and they can barely stay awake, because it's like, yeah, we deal with this all the time. This is like, no kidding, and they get it because they run into it. There's a very, I won't want to call it famous, but if you're interested from a sort of a more tame Christian context, we'll pick on the Lutherans here. There's a book called I Am Not Afraid. It's by a Lutheran guy, and you can't get any more unexcited than Lutherans, okay? These aren't charismatics, okay? So it was this, guy had to write a dissertation, and his dissertation topic was like church planting in Africa. So he went to some group that his church and his denomination was helping in Africa. And when he got over there, part of their liturgy, everywhere they went, and their order of service was exorcisms. They would just go into a town, and we're going to have a church service, we're going to start a church here, and they didn't have to solicit anything. People would show up, and before they did anything, it's like, okay, we need to claim this as holy ground because of the principalities and powers, and they do whatever their service, and people would go crazy. It would sort of bring out the possession. Instead of bring out your dead, it's bring out your possessed, And they just like went through this is what we do. And this guy was like shocked. He's like, they never taught us this in seminary. Did Luther write about this? And so he wound up changing his topic to write about that. Because he couldn't believe it. He'd never seen anything like it. And to the people over there, they're still Lutherans, they're still boring. Okay, they're still not charismatic. But they're like, yep, it's just what we need to do here. So we do it. Because if we didn't do it, we wouldn't get anywhere. Okay. Get her done. So I trust people who have no reason to lie to me, and they have no reason to just lie in general. missionaries from all over the world. Yeah, we went into that town, and there was just this place that we were told, this is owned, this is under dominion. And you get a confrontation there, something goes on there. I mean, there's something that is going on there. So I think that stuff does happen and can happen. It's a reflection of, again, the whole cosmic geographical thing. So it's either that or it's, again, some low-level, demonic entity. Because, again, if you know the terminology, sons of God, the geographical dominion guys, are at they're higher on the pecking order in both biblical and standard Jewish demonology. Go ahead.
Does that go to what you're talking about, like Fern and Audrey?
They run into it occasionally. They don't run into a whole lot of that.
I actually had a different question, if I could.
Yeah. Well, there was a question over here.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. We've been going through Corinthians, and this kind of goes back to something you just mentioned a minute ago. Paul's new creation language in 2 Corinthians 5. Generally speaking, I've always heard it taught and kind of understood it as, well, yeah, when we become believers, we need to live our lives according to the gospel. We need to live our lives like Christ would live our lives, or Christ lived his life. And you just get this kind of giant overview of this is what you're supposed to be as a new creation. You need to live your life correctly. But going through like 1 Corinthians 15, resurrection chapter, it seems Paul has like a much more focused idea, I think, behind the new creation language. And as we kind of talk about, like,
are you suggesting it has something to do with the rolling back of the nations?
Well, yeah,
and their gods.
We talk about like the three rebellions. We have
sounds suspiciously biblical.
We have the sacrifice of Christ, of course, allowing us communion with God again, kind of reversing the fall, if you will. We have the spreading of the gospel, which is reversing Deuteronomy 32. The Spirit, indwelling believer, and the new creation language, is that a reversal of Genesis 6?
I think it's a reversal of all of it.
All of it.
Okay. When I think about the Messiah, just in academic terms, the Messiah was about undoing all of it. The cross is about a solution for the problem of death. That was the result of what happens in Genesis 3. Estrangement from God. We are separated, estranged from the source of life. You cannot have eternal life unless you are in the presence of God. Okay, so it's about a solution for that. It's about a solution for the general proliferation of depravity in the world, which, again, Second Temple Jews are going to lay squarely at the feet of the whole Genesis 6 thing. It's also about reversing what happened at Babel, taking the nations back, making the Gentiles part of the people of God again. Again, all of it. The Messiah is critical to all of that. And we just spent a week with Fern and Audrey at the end of September. And what they wanted this year, they wanted to spend, I say a week, it's 3 days, it's always 3 days. They wanted to spend 3 days on the theme of the death of the gods, or the defeat of the gods. And so we went through a couple Old Testament passages, but I think that the best thing for them, and we started in 1 Corinthians 15, is when Paul talks about the resurrection, for sure he talks about Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection, and you're united to Christ, you're in Christ, all these familiar Pauline terms, to identify us with the one who rose from the dead, and Paul's teaching, then you're going to rise from the dead too. Okay, that's the way we hear it in church. Nothing wrong with it, it's true. But what we miss is that Paul often connects resurrection language with the defeat of the principalities and the powers and the rulers and the authorities. He does it in half a dozen places. So the question is, it's easy to see why Paul, when he's thinking about resurrections, thinks about his own resurrection and living forever with the Lord. That's easy. Why does he keep thinking about, the principalities and the powers and the nations? Okay, that's why, because they need to be brought back into the fold. The resurrection was the key event to take the effect of what the Messiah did and apply it to the cosmic geographical Gentile problem. And the Gentile problem is not just that they're not Jews. The Gentile problem is that they are under dominion. And And that was God's own decision all the way back into Babel. And so the messaging is really clear. You know, Jesus is saying, I am not here, what I did, what I'm doing, what I did, it's not just about the Jew. It's not just about, you know, fulfilling covenants given to the Jews. It is about reversing this whole set of circumstances. It's about everything. And so in Paul's mind, since this was why he was called to go to the Gentiles, this is in his head the whole time. This is the authority, because now he can go to a Gentile and he can say, look, dude, I know that Yahweh, the God of Israel, put all of you guys under dominion because of what happened at Babel. Burnett's paper goes into Plato, into Philo. The secular Greco-Roman world had the same view, that the nations had been assigned their gods. Okay, they had the same view. So the Gentiles know what he's talking about. It's just that Paul says that the one behind this is the God of Israel, and it was a punishment. It's not a good thing. You were punished by this. So you think that to be right with those gods, you have to stay put and worship them and believe them. Well, I'm here to tell you that's just garbage. I'm here to tell you that Jesus of Nazareth was this God, the Most High, in flesh, incarnate, died on the cross, rose again, and you don't have to obey these other powers. In fact, it's not a bad thing if you disobey them. It's what the real God wants you to do. He wants you to reject them. He wants you back in the fold. That's why he writes to the Galatians, having once tasted the heavenly gift, are you going back to be enslaved? It's like, this is insane. You people are insane. Again, because he's thinking of it in these terms. Why do you want to be shackled to beings that are already defeated? As the church grows, it's proof that their rule is invalidated. It becomes the legal basis for saying, you don't belong here anymore. You have no authority. And if you've listened to the Fern and Audrey podcast, that's important language to them because of who they minister to. They'll be in sessions and get into that sort of language, and people just, especially the ones who have some occult background, they just get that instantly, and it matters to them. But that isn't the only thing they see. But they get a lot of that sort of thing going on. Go ahead.
So, of the three fallen groups, and is there? You know, I'm a fireman, so I work in the incident command system and span of control. Are they working for one incident commander? I mean, is that Lucifer? Are they independent? Yeah. Are they just all doing their own thing?
I'm gonna. Again, there's no verse that actually spells this out, but okay. The question is, what's the pecking order? What's the hierarchy? Who do all the bad guys work for one bad guy? You know, for Satan. I actually don't think that they all work for Satan. I think they all have a common enemy, and the common agenda is control. I think Satan is called what he's called, you know, the God of this world, because he owns humanity in a theological sense, and if we're going to use legal vocabulary. Why? Because all humans die. Okay, he essentially owns their soul, and the resurrection is the solution to that. You have to have, the resurrection is important. You have to have a death before it, or else you don't have a resurrection. And once you have one, you can't go back to being dead. So that is the solution for that ownership problem. And he's the one that reaps that benefit, as it were, or reaps that result of his own rebellion and human failure. So there's that, but there's no hint in any scripture, any text that I know of, that, for instance, Satan was the one who convinced the sons of God in Genesis 6 to go do that. There's nothing like that. Satan was the one who put the bug in God's ear to assign the other nations to other sons of God, knowing that they would rebel. There's nothing like that. So there's definitely pecking order language. Sons of God is a term that was used of an elite part of an administration, because you tended to give the best jobs to your relatives. They're the ones you sort of have on a tighter leash. You're related to them. You know, in theory, you can trust them more, that sort of thing. This rulership language is borrowed from the ancient, Near Eastern world to telegraph to us that there's a hierarchical system. Angel, Malach, Angelos, it's just a messenger. That's what they do. They don't govern territory, they take messages. It's a job description. So there is a pecking order in terms of tasks, very task oriented. But there's nothing that says they all work for one guy. I think he gets primacy of place as well, not just because of the death, the mortality problem, and the one who ruined God's plan initially. But since he was the first rebel, he has sort of street cred among all the other rebels. And I think what he says to Jesus in the temptation was sincere. In other words, he knows who Jesus is. It's very evident. He knows why he's here in terms of what the end game is. Well, the Son of God's here. He wouldn't be here unless God had that silly kingdom of God thing on his brain again, this restoring the kingdom idea. So we know, he's the son of David. We know what God's angling for here. He wants control of the earth again. So he says to Jesus, I can give you that. I can give you the nations of the world. Okay, and I read that as saying that I believe that the devil believed he could pull that off. He can say, look, he can say to all the other guys, look, we'll surrender our sovereignty to the Son of the Most High if he bows down and worships me. Okay, so I think the offer was sincere in that respect. And Jesus is like, well, I know something you don't. I know that really doesn't solve the problem, A, because I have to die and rise again. And I'm not spilling the beans here either. And I don't need what you're offering. I have another way of getting it. So, eat dust, just get out of here. So I tend to think, again, they're free will beings as well. They have a common enemy. They want control, but that doesn't mean that they all salute, one entity. I think there's competition.
We call that independent action.
Yes. Go ahead, Laurie.
I just want to go back to what you described before when you were talking about Paul was assigned to the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. As a baby Christian, when you learn about Paul, you learn about he is the Jewish academic, right? And you think, well, why isn't he assigned to the Jews? They don't understand. He was killing Jews. He can teach those Pharisees. What's going on? But that's what's amazing when you learn about all this stuff. The Genesis 6. It's like, that's why. It's because he knew his Bible.
He's the perfect choice.
Exactly.
He not only knows his Bible really well, but he knows lots of other texts really well.
Exactly.
Because he quotes more external texts more often than anyone else in the New Testament. So,
Can you explain his training, just brief little?
Well, he sat at the feet. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel. That's in his in some biographical language Paul uses. So, Gamaliel was a well-known, highly respected teacher in rabbinic Judaism. He would have been a recognized authority within the whole community, and so Paul was his student. And based upon what you read in Acts, and again some of the stuff he says in Philippians, but Paul was either a member of the Sanhedrin or sort of a member in waiting. Some people argue about that based upon what may have been Paul's age. Was he married or not? And, all that sort of stuff. But he certainly had high stature. He was also extremely well-read. He uses Septuagint. He uses Targum at some time. He quotes Hebrew. He quotes, Greek poets. He quotes Second Temple Jewish literature. He quotes, classical, religious texts. It's very evident that he had for his day, he had a premier education, and a member of the Pharisee party, as he says in Philippians. So, there's plenty of Pharisees to go around who knew their Old Testament really well, but there were only a handful that were steeped in Hellenistic material. So Paul becomes, in hindsight, a really good choice. We'll take one more and then we should get going. I'm on a leash today, but go ahead.
You mentioned the alignment of September 11th, 3 BC, and so I've heard you sidestep this question before.
And I'll sidestep it again.
Is there another alignment in the future, near future?
Oh yes,
you
there.
can see?
I'm sorry. The question is, in regard to the September 11th, 3 BC birth, is there going to be an alignment of the same circumstances in the future? The short answer is yes. In the portent, I do not give the date for that, nor will I. There's a lot of talk on the internet about this. That when anybody know when the world is supposed to end again next? It's like no, it's in September in 27. I think it's September 23rd or something like that, 2017. Oh, I get them in email, so I. Yeah, something like that. And part of the problem is there are people who are, there's some methodological flaws to this. Number one, there isn't a single verse in the New Testament or in the Bible period that tells us we should look for the same set of astronomical circumstances that were present at the birth of the Messiah and will be present at his second coming. There is zero, not a single verse. We're also never told, B, what the sign of the Son of Man is. Okay, because there's astronomical language associated with the second coming, and the one reference point that we're given is the sign of the Son of Man. Okay, that's nice. Is that the set of birth circumstances? Is that the set of circumstances at the crucifixion? Is that the set of circumstances at the resurrection? Or does it mean something totally different? Does it just mean the Lord, when he comes back, hey, there he is, the Son of Man? Has nothing to do with astronomy. The answer is, it could be any of that or none of it. We just aren't told. We are told that no man knows the day or hour, so I would suggest that since you can track days and hours with astronomy, that's probably not the thing that we should be looking at with any certainty as far as the second coming of Christ. Now, you'll have people endlessly speculate about this on the end, and of course, I mean, who knows why? I could get real nasty and speculate why. Some people are just desperate for a following, I guess. But they'll. How many of you have read The Portent? I'm not going to give another spoiler here. Okay. I have a Mantello. Okay, Mantello is real. He's just not a mute Pakistani kid. He's somebody else. And I get emails from him regularly about, look at this, look at that. And he sends me all these charts, and it's full of astronomy talk, and most of it goes over my head, which is why I need him. But he'll say, here they go again. They're plotting this thing out, and they're assuming that the only signs that matter are the ones in Revelation 12. Or they're assuming a specific set of signs that were present on September 11, 3 BC, not realizing that there are things present at that date that aren't present at this one, because the sky is the sky and always will be the sky. So how many parameters should we put in here? How many should we consider? And he'll just give me the whole grocery list of these things. Now, I know, because he doesn't use BCC, I know who else gets that information. And there are people who are getting that information that should be just shutting up, but instead will take parts that they want to take and put it on their website and put it into videos and put it into books so they can gain a following. Okay, I have not posted about that. I'm just waiting for the right time to do that. Okay, so oh no, right after the failure. Right after the failure, yes, I know where the information goes. But, again, I just think it's wrong, to be a date setter. And so I will not put what Mantello thinks. Mantello would say it like this. He'd say, well, if we're supposed to look at this, here's what we'd look for. Okay, and yes, there are dates like that. You can plot them out. You can do all sorts of stuff with them. So if I were of this mindset, here's what I would be putting out there. So, you know, I'm just not going to do that. I think it's irresponsible. People will run with it. Even you know, people know me by now, I'm not going to do that. But that's not going to stop somebody else from doing it.
Thank you.
You know? In the back, last one.
Will this new book be an audible version and a digital version?
The Enoch book will be on Kindle. I don't know about the audio. I'd have to ask Tom if he has a plan there. I don't know that they've ever done an audio book, but he might consider it. And it's the same with the novels are not in audio. Unseen Realm is, but that was a publisher decision. I've actually never listened to it. So they hired some guy who does that. I don't even know what it sounds like.
That's pretty good.
Okay.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Is he British?
No,
is
I'm
it
just
British?
No.
Oh darn! Right. Yeah. I'd love to sound British. Yeah. So I don't know, but I'll ask him. I'll ask him if there's any. The only one I know about is Kindle, because that's in the contract, but I don't know what else.
By the way, it's 15 hours long.
It is? Okay. 15. Yeah, it took a lot longer. 1 hour for every year it took to produce the thing. Yeah. Somebody do the gematria on that. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for your patience.